Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Lars Nielsen and I am the author of How the Book of Mormon Came to Pass, the second greatest show on earth. The purpose of this video is to respond to some of the criticisms of my new theory on how the Book of Mormon came to pass that Dan Vogel has posted in 2 YouTube videos. Let me first state unequivocally that I am grateful to Mr. Vogel for pointing out ways in which I might improve my theory and my own abilities. Unfortunately, however, Mr. Vogel seems to deliberately mischaracterize my work and has decided to lace his comments with disdain and unprofessionalism. Fortunately, with patience, attention to detail, and time, all of his extensive misinformation can be rectified. I recently had the privilege of participating in Sunstone 2024. After my presentation, I was fortunate enough to discuss with the keynote speaker, Dan McClellan, about some of the ideas in my book. In that conversation, he said that he did not think that Joseph Smith had composed the Book of Mormon. That he read or dictated it to his scribes, yes, but that he composed it, no. I asked him whether he favored any specific authorship theory, perhaps one involving the Smith family, Solomon Spaulding, Dartmouth, or Sidney Rigdon. He then said that he has decided not to focus on the origin of the Book of Mormon academically or online. I did not press him on his reasons for staying quiet about this view, but I did confirm with him again, for good measure, in case I had misheard him, that he doesn't think that Joseph Smith composed the Book of Mormon. Of course, I don't speak for Dan McClellan, and I am not suggesting that he has in any way, shape, or form endorsed my book. He had not read it by the time we spoke. I only bring this up to make the point that he is a very well-respected professional who, having been trained in cognitive linguistics, textual criticism, and the science of religion, does not reside in the Smith sole-authorship camp, which he freely disclosed to me at a well-respected conference and not under any confidentiality. Really quickly, before getting into Mr. Vogel's first mischaracterization of my work, I'll take a minute to display what I am now calling the Dan spectrum. At one end, we have Dan Peterson. I presume that several viewers are familiar with the nature of his caustic rhetoric, apologetic style of argumentation, and unrestrained use of fallacies in the furtherance of faith. On the other end of the spectrum are people like Daniel Stolzenberg and Dan McClellan, who do not tolerate the harassment of creators and do not mischaracterize someone else's content as a means to combat misinformation or hawk their own theory. I will leave it to the viewer to judge where Mr. Vogel seems to reside on this continuum. Regardless, I hope this video will help Mr. Vogel recognize where he himself is and decide for himself what kind of a critic he wants to be with the time that he has left. The first mischaracterization that Mr. Vogel makes is his straw man depiction of my theory as a conspiracy theory, which it is not. In his own words, he says,
"This new theory is really the old Spaulding theory, with an added layer of conspirators and complexity."
But this is not true. My version of the Spaulding-Rigdon-Smith theory is not a conspiracy theory, and it is less complex than any other Spaulding-based theory. In the book, I defined K5C to be the subset of all prior Spaulding-Rigdon-Smith subtheories that characterize Sidney Rigdon as a co-conspirator in some fashion. Likewise, I defined K5P to be a new subset of Spaulding-Rigdon-Smith subtheories in which Rigdon is preeminently pious. In the book, I contend that the biggest problem with all prior Spaulding-Rigdon-Smith subtheories is that they never tried to assume positive intent on Rigdon's part and consequently, unfortunately, had some conspiracy theory flavor to them, that both Rigdon and Smith must have known that they were making things up together, colluding, and lying about them to some significant degree, probably for the money. But such need not be the case, I wrote. No historian has ever considered a non-conspiracy version of the Spaulding-Rigdon-Smith theory, which change in perspective resolves many of the difficulties with earlier versions of the theory. As Mr. Vogel well knows, I don't portray Rigdon and Smith as villainous conspirators at all, but rather as sincerely believing that the manuscript in Rigdon's possession was a blessing from God and a passably true, albeit incomplete, ancient American history, as Spalding had plainly intended. I present as a possibility that Rigdon earnestly believed that the cave of golden plates to which his manuscript referred was real, and that he needed help finding such a trove, which might be why he later got connected to Smith, probably through Parley P. Pratt, precisely because Smith had advertised himself as one capable of finding golden things that had been buried by those who had gone before using his peepstone. Vogel's attempt to mischaracterize my theory as a conspiracy theory is an instance of the straw man fallacy. His attempt to color me as a conspiracy theorist by association is also fallacious. I'm not saying that I didn't make any mistakes when writing my book, but I am saying if the truth is on Mr. Vogel's side, he shouldn't have to mischaracterize. That's what apologists do.
One thing that increased the size of the book was his insistence on examining his new theory within a dreadful 7-part schema. Imagine the mess we would create if we did this to every theory.
First, I never suggested that we should do this for every theory, but I do think we should do it when there are many sub-theories out there that can be reasonably grouped together into mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive groups, which is the case here. Second, this is in fact how good scientists and even detectives lay out their hypotheses so that data can be interpreted differently under competing assumptions without cross-contamination of conclusions. In a murder case, for example, suspects might be treated as theories, with different motives generating distinct sub-theories. One well-published Mormon historian who has a PhD in American history and a Master's of Divinity said to me in an email after reading my book, quote, "I like the intellectual framing of laying out a variety of hypotheses to explain a problem and asking readers to choose the one that requires the smallest leap of faith, or at least to recognize that the option they're choosing requires a leap of faith." Close quote. So, organizing theories and sub-theories is not Mr. Vogel's cup of tea, but doing so seems to be helpful to some. It was helpful to me, and I got good feedback from several readers that it was helpful to them. Now let's turn our attention to the Kircherisms in the Book of Mormon. Here's a quote that a tenured professor of religious history said to me in writing some weeks ago. Quote, "In terms of your argument, I love what you've done with Kircherisms. I agree that they, especially Nephi and the spiritually magnetic compass, demand an explanation." Close quote. Mr. Vogel's position is that they don't need an explanation because I'm desperately looking for connections that are not there.
As interesting as Kircher's Nephi may be, I think there are better explanations for the appearance of Nephi in the Book of Mormon that are simpler and more direct.
All right, let's see it.
Because Nephi describes himself as large in stature, some have suggested that Joseph Smith may have been inspired by the Hebrew word Nephilim, meaning giant, used in the Old Testament and Apocrypha to describe various people as large and strong.
First, and it is a small point, but today the word is properly pronounced Nephilim, not Nephilim.
Nephilim. Nephilim.
Second, this is not evidence that Joseph Smith created the character Nephi. It is simply evidence that whoever constructed the fictional character was familiar enough with Hebrew, the Old Testament, and/or the Apocrypha to cleverly give his character Nephi a quality associated with a similarly spelled word. Solomon Spalding fits this bill much better than Joseph Smith. Recall that Spalding had studied Hebrew, the King James Bible, and theology thoroughly at Dartmouth College, and then was a Dartmouth missionary for almost a decade, preaching among the Native Americans. In his Fabius story within Manuscripts Found, Spalding made up another tale about men who were abnormally large in stature. Spalding has Fabius find a special race of Native Americans that seems to be a remnant of an older race, saying that, quote, The construction of their bodies, their customs, manners, laws, government, and religion all demonstrate that they must have originated from some other nation. As to their persons, they were taller, on an average, than I had ever seen in any nation. Their bones were large, limbs straight, and shoulders broad. They clothed themselves in cloth which was manufactured from the hair of mammoons." Close quote. For Spalding, mammoons and mammoths were closely related species of woolly mastodons. Fabius narrates that he found records among the people containing characters, not letters, that were written right to left, top to bottom, and contained diacritical marks to show variation of case, mood, and tense. In this same paragraph, Fabius speculates that the writing might have come from Egypt or Chaldea. This was Spalding setting up the next story in his manuscripts found involving reformed Egyptian. In the same paragraph, Fabius also says, quote, "At present I shall waive the account of its introduction," implying that he would discuss the Egyptian-like, Hebrew-like record that he found later in the story. In the Romance of Celeste, another of Spalding's unpublished works of fiction, a main character gives a pre-war prayer of protection, not unlike the pre-war speeches in the Book of Mormon, in which he mentions the Anakim specifically, who are biblically supposed to be the descendants of the Anak and the Nephilim. Quote, "We are but babes and infants in thy cause, but with thy fostering care we soon shall rise in strength and stature like the Anakim, and in the greatness of the soul as the sons of Jesse." Close quote. In toto, there is much more evidence that Spalding knew about the lore of the Nephilim and was inspired by it enough to cleverly incorporate it into multiple works of fiction, yea, even all of his works of fiction. There is no such support for Smith, for whom there is no evidence of ever having composed anything before allegedly composing the Book of Mormon at the age of 22 with essentially zero literary acquirements. On this point, Spalding is a much better fit, and the witness statements for Spalding composing the Nephi-Mormon story, and specifically recalling the name Nephi, are more and more credible than the ones for Smith. Indeed, Smith and his witnesses are adamant that Smith did not compose, and could not have composed, the Book of Mormon. That Smith put on a convincing, performative demonstration using a text that he did not compose is a much better framework for interpreting the statements of the 3 and 8 witnesses.
Some in Joseph Smith's day believed some of the mound builders were a large people.
True, but a higher percentage of the people in Solomon Spalding's day seemed to believe that the mound builders might have been a large people. The general belief was well into decline long before 1830. We don't actually know whether Smith believed it before he would have got his hands on a post-Spalding manuscript, and we don't know whether Spalding himself literally believed the mound builders to be large. He probably didn't. But we do know that Spalding capitalized on the popular belief, incorporating the idea into multiple stories. In terms of background, tying the Native Americans linguistically and archaeologically to the Old Testament through the Lost 10 Tribes or other connections was the obsession of Eleazar Wheelock, the first president of Dartmouth College. His belief, as I was saying, waned over the next 50 years to some degree, but was still strong when Spalding was yet a student there. We also have evidence that Spalding attended the openings of some mounds. There is no historical evidence suggesting Smith had done so, or that he even had an interest, again, before he would have received Spalding's manuscript, likely through Rigdon.
And Joseph Smith seems to have believed that as well, describing the Jaredite breastplates as large in Mosiah 8, verse 10.
Again, this is not evidence that Smith wrote the Book of Mormon. It's not even evidence that the original composer of Mosiah 8 verse 10 literally believed anything, no more than a Marvel comic serves as evidence that its producer literally believed in the origin stories of its characters. But it is evidence that the original composer of what later became the Book of Mormon was consistent in the lore he was laying down. Under the assumption of Smith's sole authorship, Mr. Vogel can speculate all he wants about what Smith may have believed, but his speculation does not survive outside that assumption of Smith's sole authorship, nor does it serve as evidence for the claim of Smith's sole authorship. To be clear, it is always fine to state an assumption and see where it takes you, but we must remember that any determination thus derived is a conditional conclusion and not independent evidence in support of the assumption. To do otherwise, which seems to have happened here with Mr. Vogel, is a hidden form of circular reasoning.
The Nephite interpreters, described as 2 stones, which were fastened into 2 rims of a bow, were so large that Joseph Smith said he could only look through one lens at a time.
Again, this is not evidence that Smith composed the specific sentences in the Book of Mormon that describe the Nephite interpreters as being fastened into 2 rims of a bow attached to a breastplate. A better explanation is that Smith saw these things in his mind's eye, in his imagination, or in his peepstone, after having read the words that were written by someone else. As we know, the accounts of people having seen or handled these interpreters are inconsistent on many points, including the size, shape, and opacity of the stones. This is probably because Smith himself was wildly inconsistent, as Von Brody noted when telling different versions of his ostensible translation process to see what would stick, as he did with so many other stories, like the first vision, the ex post facto appearances of Peter, James, and John, and the retroactive 1823 visitations of Moroni. Incidentally, I do think that Smith probably made some spectacle-like prop from his own materials, just as he probably also made a fake set of plates for his own reasons.
Nephi also appears in the apocryphal book 2 Maccabees 1:36 as a place name. Interestingly, Lehi is also a place name in Judges 15, meaning jawbone.
That's true, but it is far more likely that Spalding would have read and referred to the details of 2 Maccabees and Judges 15 than Smith. In fact, in the Romance of Celeste, Spalding quotes directly from multiple chapters within the Book of Judges. In other places, he weaves the themes and proper nouns from such chapters into the plot without direct quotation. He even composed a 48-line hymn conspicuously based on and heavily borrowing from Judges 4 and 5, all the while keeping in the early Middle English style of the King James Version of the Bible. Spalding incorporates many, and sometimes very obscure, details from the Old Testament into the plots and commentaries within his Fabius text, within what later became the Book of Mormon, and countless times within the Romance of Celeste. As we shall see, Spalding is the one who expertly plays around with place names and person names that tie to the Bible, not Smith.
Maccabees recounts that after the return to Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity and rebuilding of the temple, the prophet Nehemiah searched for the holy fire, which the priest had hidden in a pit, but found only muddy water. When he sprinkled some of this water on the altar, the wood began to burn, and thus the eternal flame was restored to the temple.
I think Mr. Vogel includes this story as if to suggest that Joseph Smith had chosen the name Nephi for one of his main characters, perhaps because it had something to do with sacred fire, which might have appealed to Smith as a village magician, although Vogel doesn't connect those dots explicitly. But there is nothing about sacred fire, mystical fire, or holy fire in any writings by Joseph Smith or about Joseph Smith. He does mention fire and even eternal fire in the Doctrine and Covenants, but only in generally religious tropes, such as hellfire, baptism by fire, conversion by fire, flaming swords, etc. In all likelihood, Smith probably didn't even know that the second book of Maccabees even existed. According to Smith's neighbors, they were not a church-going family in general and were comparatively lazy, idle, and indolent, with Mother Smith showing only limited interest in religion after experiencing a near-death illness herself, and again after Alvin's death. Spalding, however, in The Romance of Celeste, discusses the true fire, heavenly fire, electrical fire, holy fire, holier fire, and seraphic fire 14 times. In discussing the physical flames of lamps, he talks of them in Old Testament terms. Quote, "We'll light the lamp and kindle up the seraph fire that yet may shine on others' paths." Close quote. On one occasion, he describes a fire as the purest white flame I ever beheld. He discusses chariots of fire, the fires of hell, fire in the soul, fire at the bottom of the sea, ethereal flames, and so on. He also asserts that, quote, "He who sits above all nature and first lent the glowing emanation of himself will never let the sacred spark in dark corruption rest." Close quote. This is about as close to Nehemiah's maintenance of the eternal flame as we might expect in romantic fiction from the 1800s, and it is in the writing of Solomon Spalding, who for over 100 years was considered by all naturalists to be the default author of the Book of Mormon.
That Joseph Smith would use two place names for his characters shouldn't bother us, for the Book of Mormon is full of place names, which are also names of people.
To that I would say this, that Solomon Spalding would use place names for many of his characters shouldn't bother us, for the Fabius story, the Mormon story, and the Romance of Celeste are full of place names that are also names of people. The following might seem like a very long digression, but I promise that it is necessary context for addressing this and upcoming criticisms, after which we'll come back to Nephi. Spalding implies that the Delaware River in real life got its modern name from a Hebrewish cognate, Delawa, as it appears in the Fabius text. Pause to read the supportive quotations if you're interested. By the way, number one, we learn from the text that Fabius meets these people around 400 AD, which is curious because that is approximately when the Mormon story starts to wind up. By the way, number two, Dartmouth missionaries, as we know from the Dartmouth archives, did a lot of missionary work among the Delawans. For context, this is from one of President Wheelock's letters. Quote, "The names of several animals in their language are the very same with the Hebrew. Perhaps when we are able to send missionaries among them who are well instructed in the Hebrew tongue, we may be furnished with the fullest evidence from that quarter. I here send you enclosed a specimen of the writing of my two Delawares, and I doubt not you would be much pleased to hear them read Latin and Greek." Spalding does the same thing with Susquehanna in the Fabius story, which he implies has been a great river with its Hebrewish name for 1,000 years. Of course, it maps to the real-life Susquehanna River. If you're at all doubting whether the AH suffix would signal to Spalding's readers a Hebrew ancestry when attached to his proper nouns, consider the following list: Adam-ah, Amma, Baal-ah, Judah, etc. The direction of the arrows here shows what I think was Spalding's direction of thought, starting with the modern-day river, putting it back in time, and then playing around with various and well-known forms of phonological drift, that is, shifting to nearby consonants and mutating vowel sounds over time. This he did, probably in loving memory of his favorite professor of Oriental languages at Dartmouth, Professor John Smith, who was studying precisely those things within the Native American dialects while preparing his Hebrew grammars for publication. Spalding also intended that his readers believe that the modern-day Ohio River descended from this fictional, more ancient body of water, the River Owaho. From time to time, he even slips into calling it the River Ohio in the Fabius story. The Owaho is both a river and a land, which, with an extra silent letter, in this case H, just for fun, and with the highly reused suffix on, morphs into a great city, Owahon, where the Ohion people reside and where the Ohion government is formed. Pause to read if you'd like. Spalding also creates a pseudo-historical link between the king of Geneseo, the land over which he rules, and the Genesee River, which has long been the lifeblood of Rochester, New York. Quote, "Not far behind appeared Ramac, the king of Geneseo, furious and resolute. He had made the utmost expedition to collect his forces, 10,000 bold and robust warriors." Close quote. Cattaraugus Creek, which is quite long in real life, is retroactively transformed into a land and also into the king of Cattaraugus. As we shall see, dropping consonants or doubling them up are commonplace when Spalding invents new names from real-life ideas or creates altered ones from prior fictional names, the same way that his sources of inspiration did, including Homer in the Iliad, Virgil in the Aeneid, and Macpherson in the poetry of Ossian. In real life, Kentucky is reportedly the Shawnee word Kaintaki, meaning head of the river. Whether Spalding knew that or not, he remakes the real-life Kentucky River into the more ancient River Kentuck, the land of Kentuck, the empire of Kentuck, the princes and king of Kentuck, and the people of Kentuck, also called the Kentuckans. Now, isn't this phrase curious from the Fabius text? They were called in their language Delawanax. Notice how Spalding thought about phonologically connecting the Delawans with the Kentucks linguistically, but may have changed his mind because the people were so different culturally. It's amazing that we can see today into Spalding's creative process as he composed his American Aeneid. Quote, "He led them on against this gallant and desperate band of Kentucks, and made a most furious and violent charge upon them." Close quote. There are several bands of warriors, bands of soldiers, and bands of robbers in the land of Kentuck, and in the land northward along the modern-day Allegheny Mountains, which I will discuss more later on. The Scioto River in the Fabius story is supposed to be the precursor to the modern-day Scioto River. On this map from Spalding's day, you can see it was often spelled without a C, sometimes as Scioto with a final O, and sometimes as Sciota with a final A. Inspired by this, Spalding gives us a land, a kingdom, an empire, a king, an emperor, and several princes. With the self-evident suffix "an," he also gives us a people. Bombal, the king of the Kentucks, a nation which lived on the south side of the great river Ohio, had taken great umbrage against Hadokam, the king of Sciota. There are many more examples in the Fabius story of Spalding playing cleverly with place names and person names, but these are the ones that are specifically and most conspicuously derived from modern rivers. It is not at all a stretch that Spalding would do the same thing, specifically and consistently leveraging bodies of water for his proper names, in the next phase of his epic story within manuscripts found, which is the Mormon story. Without a doubt, the most important river in the Fabius story is the Scioto River. Without a doubt, the most important river in the Mormon story is the River Sidon. In ancient times, Sidon was a major port city known for its trade and maritime power. It means something close to fishing in several languages. In terms of person names in the Bible, Sidon was the firstborn son of Canaan, who was a son of Ham, he who was supposedly cursed with dark skin, thereby making Sidon a great-grandson of Noah. So the river Sidon, dividing a dark-skinned people from a lighter-skinned people who all descended from the same family, was Spalding being clever with names and bodies of water, consistent with his pattern and purpose. Sidon is also a hill. Notice N softening to M is a common phonological shift that seems to lend some authenticity to the naming system. Beyond being a biblical tie-in, Sidon serves to phonologically connect Mormon's River Sidon to Fabius's Scioto River and to the modern-day Scioto River because he knew that rivers, central to any culture, were places where linguistic connections were more likely to be preserved and discovered, as Dartmouth missionaries had speculated they might. Spalding often accomplished this with one-letter point mutations, one-letter transpositions, adding or removing prefixes and suffixes, and sometimes with swapped syllables, as we shall see. Spalding does the same thing with the real-life Lehigh River, Lehigh, which he probably plucked off a map the same way he did all the others, trying to connect lands and especially bodies of water to the Bible where possible to make his Middle Epic story more believable as a cultural offshoot from the House of Israel. He probably took names from his map, like Ceuta and Lehi, and went to a Bible dictionary. Finding Lehi to be a part of Ramoth Lehi, which means Jawbone Hill, he might have thought, nice, I'll use Lehi as a character, and since Ramoth is so similar to Rama, the name of the Native American tribe that had received Dartmouth missionaries, I'll use Rama as the name of a hill in my story, which is nice because Rama appears in the Bible with and without an H. Rachel, if you don't know, was buried in Rama with an H. Spalding also turned Lehi into a land and a people in the form of Lehi Nephi and anti-Nephi Lehis, respectively. Then Spalding thought about the Oneida tribe, to where Dartmouth missionaries were also sent, looked at his map, and saw the Oneida River, which connects Lake Oneida to the Seneca River in Upper New York. So he took Oneida, disguised the dead giveaway diphthong, and slapped on the same Hebrewish AH phoneme that he had applied to Delaware, Susquehanna, Oahu, and Ramah, yielding Oneida, Onidah, which, like Ramah, is also a hill in the Mormon story, as well as a city. But Spalding's list of hydronyms was still not quite long enough. Presumably, while searching for another name for one of his pseudo-historical rivers, Spalding might have gone to his Bible dictionary under R, looking for words that sounded like river, riffles, ripples, or rapids. This is not wishful thinking. Consider this article from the National Park Service. Quote, as Meriwether Lewis and party journeyed down the Ohio in the early fall of 1804, the keelboat frequently encountered ripples or riffles, short sections of the river where the autumn water level was so low the large vessel had to be lifted or dragged. One such ripple was Logtown Riffle, close quote, which cuts right through downtown Pittsburgh today. We don't use the term ripple this way very much anymore, but in the 1700s it was used quite ubiquitously to mean a noisy, shallow stretch of rough water in a stream. In fact, the terms rifts, riffle, and ripple were often attached to person names or local place names precisely in the locations that inspired Spalding to make for his settings in his stories. Later on, I'll show you some examples of that on a very peculiar map. I suspect that in his Bible dictionary, Spalding found Riblah, which was both a village just off the Sea of Galilee and a small town on a hill touching the modern-day Orontes River along the border between Lebanon and Syria. Removing his AH suffix, he saw ripple and thought, I can work with that. After all, phonological drift between fricatives like B and P happen all the time, so he changed Riblah to Riplah, which is the name he gave to another hill in the Book of Mormon. Changing the AH to Ancum, I'll show you how and why he constructed that part in an upcoming slide, Spalding produced the waters of Ripley-Ancum, which, in addition to the idea of the many ripples around Pittsburgh, may or may not have been associated with Ripple Lake in his mind. Ripple Lake is a small lake in Ontario, north of where some of the Rama tribe lived. He also curiously used ripple while constructing a person name, Riplakish, which is a nice segue because it brings me to the next body of water on my list that has a potential intentional connection to the Bible, the Kishon River. We've already seen some evidence that Spalding was highly influenced by the Book of Judges, but there is more. In the Romance of Celeste, the climax of the 412-page story happens when the main character, Philander, whose name means lover of men, and the Florentine heroes, whose name is meant to honor that enlightened city of the Renaissance, defeat a multitude of mountain-dwelling robbers. That mountain, says the text, is at the westmost end of the Allegheny Mountains. Spoiler alert. At the climax, by faith much larger than a mustard seed, the captive Florentines sing and pray for deliverance. At the benediction, their hymns and prayers literally, not figuratively, but not quite horizontally, slice right through the great mountain, causing it to slide down from its high place to the bottom of the valley next to it, killing all its inhabitants, which are many. Their Florentine faith moved a mountain. The narrator says, quote, "The bluff of the mountain slid off and went down with a crash that seemed for the moment to convulse the whole earth. And now, though the mountain lies low, a nation sleeps beneath her power. And yet perhaps some generation, yet unborn, may quarry marble here, and oft consult the wise geologist to learn whose bones are these. But lest some wild mistake shall guide their judgment wrong, I'll tell the tale. I don't know about you, but that reminds me of the robber-infested mountains in the Book of Mormon that get their comeuppance when God destroys them, saying, quote, "And the inhabitants thereof have I buried up in the depths of the earth to hide their wickedness and abominations from before my face." Close quote. Now here's the part that ties into Spalding's rivers of water. After the mountain crashes down, the narrator says that a cascade, quote, "spread a wider stream and seemed, as it poured down its new declivity, to have been originally designed to wash away the foul stain of the bandits' subterranean empire. The widespread current passed over the inclined plane that had formed the bottom of the caverns, and after cleansing the upper surface of the smooth granite rock upon which had been built the marble quarries that formed the walls of the caverns, it receded to its present channel." Close quote. To me, that sounds a bit like the Book of Mormon too. Quote, "And waters have I caused to come up in the stead thereof, to hide their wickedness and abominations from before my face, that the blood of the prophets and the saints shall not come up any more unto me against them." Close quote. And now notice that in the Florentine hero's supplication, just minutes before deliverance, they verbatim quoted Judges 5:21. "The river of Kishon swept them away, that ancient river, the river Kishon." So Spalding imagines that as an answer to prayer, a type and shadow of the biblical Kishon River swept away an American band of robbers and cleansed the blood-stained earth they left behind. He recycled this idea from an earlier work of epic fiction that he had just finished composing, but wasn't able to get published, which is the Mormon story within manuscripts found. In other words, the same way that Homer, Virgil, and Macpherson would meld modern places with ancient stories to create their own, albeit anachronistic, epic fiction, Spalding took yet another river from his day, the Kishkumenettus River, put it back in time, and created a nefarious character named Kishkumen, who was the leader of a band of robbers. True to form, he also made Kishkumen the name of a city.
Did a small river located about 36 miles northeast of Pittsburgh with the Native American name of Kishkumenettos influence the Book of Mormon name Kishkumen? This is very doubtful. Kishkumen first appears in Helaman 1 verse 9. But prior to this, in verse 3 appears Pekumenai, which appears nowhere else in the Book of Mormon. Before this, Kumenai appears in Alma 56:14. So it could be argued that Joseph Smith was inspired by Kumenai and Pekumenai when he invented the name Kishkumen.
Let me quickly interject here that Spalding building his way to Kishkumen from Kumenai and through Pekumenai is far more supported than Smith doing so, if that's what actually happened, and I don't think that it was. Spalding's method for permutating prefixes, roots, and suffixes is consistent throughout the Fabius story, the Book of Mormon, and even the Romance of Celeste, though admittedly there are far fewer proper nouns in that ecstatic journey through the heavens. The patterns stand in Spalding's favor, which I have clearly demonstrated just in the context of rivers. On the other hand, when Smith makes up proper names in the Book of Abraham and in the Book of Moses, he does a deplorably bad, if not laughably sad, job of it, as we shall see. That said, a different direction of thought for Spalding's Kishkumen is even better, in my opinion. But first, notice how Mr. Vogel tries to imply that the Cumen part of Kishkumen must have come from Pecumeni because Pecumeni appears before and nowhere else in the Book of Mormon. Such reasoning reflects a common sole authorship belief that Smith was both orally composing and orally dictating in real time over 60 working days, making up variations of proper nouns as he went along. There are other sole authorship sub-theories in which Smith composed slowly over multiple years, either purely in his head or perhaps with writing some things down long before he started dictating. Both of these mechanisms fail on several tests, but especially regarding word cluster patterns, which, as will become clear, must have been devised by Spalding. Nevertheless, for some reason, Mr. Vogel neglects the fact that Cumen with a K and Cumenonhi, also with a K, which are clearly more tightly tied to Kishkumen than Pecumeni, both exist in the Book of Mormon, each appearing in 3 Nephi 19, which is after Helaman 1, thus undermining whatever value Mr. Vogel tried to put to Pecumeni appearing nowhere else in the Book of Mormon. But let's hear out the rest of Mr. Vogel's complaint.
But Nielsen's suggestion is seriously flawed because he has misspelled the name of the river to match the Book of Mormon better. A search in Google Books using Nielsen's spelling turns up 0 sources. It is actually the Kiski-Minitas River. Using various online pronunciations, this is how it really sounds.
Kiskimenetas. Kiskimenetas.
Kiskimenetis. Kiskimenetis.
Obviously, that sounds nothing like Kishkumen. What at first looked like a promising parallel has pretty much vanished.
Unfortunately, it is Mr. Vogel's analysis that is seriously flawed. I did not hide the spelling of the modern name, nor did I alter it to suggest a better match with the Book of Mormon person name. The older name does appear in Google Books exactly as I and Spalding had spelled it. Here is the relevant sentence from my book. Quote, "Today the latter of the two bodies of water is spelled Kiskimenetas. However, in 1770 and throughout Spalding's lifetime, it was spelled Kishkumenetas. As you can see, I provided a reference, number 232, which most conspicuously contains an active blue hyperlink to A History of the Indian Villages and Place Names in Pennsylvania." Notice how my spelling exactly matches what that reference reports in Google Books for Skoll's 1770 map. Notice also how the SH phoneme was present in the 1755 map and the 1776 map. Here are some of the actual maps, each showing Kishke, K-I-S-H-K-E. It took over 100 years for the older spelling to linguistically drift from Kishke to Kiski. Moreover, vowel shifting between K, K short E, Ki, K short I, and K, K short U, through the schwa sound, is very common, with populations and even individuals comfortably using K, Ki, and K interchangeably, and that's not wishful thinking on my part. We know that K in Kishkumen with a short E was closer to K with a short U in 1770 because the adjacent tributary is Kishkushus, K-I-S-H-K-U. We also know that the mun in Kishkumen through the schwa might have been closer to man in 1770 because of how it is spelled here, clearly with Kishkumen, M-A-N. No one should be persuaded by Mr. Vogel's presentation of two doubly repeated computer-generated pronunciations of a modern spelling, nor should any Mormon or post-Mormon just assume that their modern pronunciation for Kishkumen could not have changed from the way that its inventor had intended over 200 years ago. The correlated pronunciation of Kishkumen as Kishkumen, with a shifted stress onto the second syllable in the official Book of Mormon pronunciation guide, is not authoritative. It got rather arbitrarily correlated in 1903. By way of history, President Joseph F. Smith formed a small committee and rather hastily told his men to standardize the pronunciation of all the names in the Book of Mormon by the next day. Some were not optimistic that it could be done. Miraculously, or perhaps not miraculously, quote, by the next afternoon, recommendations from the pronunciation committee were made by Elder Penrose, who submitted, inner quote, uniform arbitrary rules, close inner quote, which the committee had formulated and which have basically been retained. 1. Words of 2 syllables should be accented on the first syllable. 2. Words of 3 syllables should be accented on the second syllable, close quote, with these exceptions. Kishkumen was not on the exceptions list, and that is how Kishkumen changed into something that, quote,
sounds nothing like Kishkumen. What at first looked like a promising parallel has pretty much...
No. What at first looked like a promising parallel has stayed a promising parallel. Now, audience, please bear with me while I go into an editorial sidebar. Dan, these observations were on the maps that I told you to look at in my footnote with an active hyperlink to make it easier for you. Going forward, please look up the footnotes before saying that evidence doesn't exist when in fact it does. Please don't accuse me of distortion. Please don't falsely attribute your imagined motives to me. If I have a mote, sir, then pluck thou out thy beam. To be clear, I am not perfect, but I am not a nefarious, conspiring villain who would do anything to bolster the Spalding theory, which I was not born into, by the way, and had never staked my reputation on before publishing my findings. I'm coming to my conclusions honestly, Dan, scouring my text for low-hanging criticisms rather than reading it for understanding is not the scholarly way. Your audience expects you to fact-check yourself and to reality check your biases at the door before you make your smackdowns. I'm saying these things to you here in a hermetically sealed editorial sidebar because my discussing your likely motives has no place in my arguments. I won't interject snide comments, use dreadful language, or drop mischaracterizations like microphones. That said, my editorialization of your unprofessional work does have a place in the broader conversation. So, in 20 seconds, I'm going to close this editorial sidebar and keep it closed until I am done dispassionately rectifying your poorly argued counterclaims. But then we're going to have a talk, so stay tuned. All that said, I am grateful to Mr. Vogel because it provides for me an opportunity to showcase other connections between the Mormon story and the Fabius story that I think are very interesting and not yet published by anyone, anywhere. At some point, not soon after Fabius's ship makes landfall somewhere along the river Delaware, Fabius and his company travel up the Delaware as far as possible before heading straight west to the river Susquehanna, which they also follow along a westerly course almost to its headwaters in the Appalachian Mountains. According to the text, Fabius and company temporarily camp a few days' journey before crossing the peaks of Allegheny Ridge. Here they learn from the Delawans about the people who live on the other side of the mountain range and how it is their tradition that they emigrated from the westward. Consequently, their pursuing a westerly path would lead them to the land of the Delawans' nativity. Fabius then says, We are also informed by some of the natives that at a distance of about 15 days' journey in a northwesterly course, there is a great river which runs in a southwesterly direction, and that along the banks of this river there are great towns and mighty kings and a people who live in a state of civilization. A 15 days' journey in a northwesterly course from here, with slow-moving teams of mamoons and mammoths to carry all their provisions over the great mountain, would put them there on the banks of the modern Allegheny River, which more or less means good stream. In the abridgment of Fabius's records, which were abridged in Latin onto 28 scrolls of parchment, it says, "From all these considerations, I am determined to remove and pursue a westerly course and seek the delightful country of their ancestors. For this purpose, my man Credo and myself, and a Delawan for an interpreter, set off. After passing through some more villages, they, quote, came to a great mountain, which we know from these and other paragraphs is the top of the Allegheny Ridge, which is the westmost part of the Appalachian Mountains. Following their predetermined course, we came to the confluence of two great rivers, which in conjunction produced a river which was called Owaho, deep enough for the navigation of ships. Those two rivers that come together at Pittsburgh to form the Owaho are the Allegheny, flowing southwest, and the Monongahela, flowing north. Before locks and dams were built, one could not reliably raft goods, for the purpose of commerce, up the Ohio River beyond this point, Logstown, on account of the ripples, which is why Fort Pitt was established here in the first place, eventually becoming Pittsburgh. This tidbit Spalding knew and threw into his Fabius story because, at the time he was writing it, he was planning on going to Pittsburgh to sell his book, and he thought it would be fun for local people to find such an Easter egg in his manuscripts found. Incidentally, on this map, wherever you see rifts, rapids, or fords, those are riffles or ripples. To get a sense of what they looked like, this is Toby's Riffle, which today is called Rap Run. Rap, with two P's, is a 200-year evolution from Ripple. Why else might this area have been so important to Spalding, inspiring him enough that he would use it or draw features from it for the settings in his Fabius story, his Mormon story, and the Romance of Celeste? If you don't know, George Washington was an absolute hero to Spalding even before he served in the Revolutionary War. Washington appears multiple times in the Romance of Celeste, one as a mortal, in a flashback within the backstory of Philander's father, two, as an immortal visitor to the subterranean caves to help the Florentine heroes fight against the band of robbers, and three, as the steward of the planet Jupiter in preparation for it becoming, through a fiery cleansing, an eventual sun, with all its moons to become future planets. Here is an excerpt from George Washington's 1754 journal, in which he discusses his journey up the Ohio River to Logstown. Quote, "The French are now coming from their forts on Lake Erie and on the creek to Venango to erect another fort, and from thence they design to the forks of Monongahela and to Logstown, and so to continue down the river, building at the most convenient places in order to prevent our settlement there. P.S. A little below Shanapinstown, in the fork, is the place where we are going immediately to build a fort as it commands the Ohio and Monongahela." Close quote. Here is Venango on this map, though it is spelled with a W instead of a V, another common form of phonological drift. You can see the triangle marking the fort that the French had built right under French Creek. Here is Shanapins with its fort. The standoff between the French on the northwest side of these unnavigable ripples and the British on the southeast of them is the conflict that ultimately led to the French and Indian War. But now look at this. In the same paragraph where Fabius discusses the route he's going to take, I'm not cherry-picking from some other part of the story, Spalding gives a little valuable foreshadowing. Quote, "It was thought to be the most prudential to find out the disposition and character of the inhabitants who were settled along the great river, lest we should fall into the hands of robbers." Close quote. Again, he is specifically talking about this stretch before the confluence of two rivers would produce the Oahu deep enough for the navigation of ships. These robbers, specifically here, are said to be, quote, "the most ferocious band of murderers that ever disgraced humanity," close quote. So, the first time we hear about a band of robbers in the Fabius story is geographically exactly right here. You may be looking at precisely the map that Spalding might have seen in his day, and smack dab in the middle is Kishkamen, if you take the Native American suffix etas off, or Kishkamen, M-A-N, if it was this contemporary map that he was looking at. Then note that the first mention of a band of robbers in the Mormon story specifically names Kishkamen as its leader. But there is more. The first big battle between the righteous people and the savage robbers is called the Battle of Gehenna, which name is quite clever. It is both a reference to the Allegheny Mountains and to the word Gehenna, which appears only in the 17th century King James Version of the Bible, which is the version that Spalding used and that appears so often in the Book of Mormon, as a translation for the word hell. Remember also that in that same paragraph corresponding to this exact place, Spalding alludes, for the first time, to the Delawans' ancient American ancestors, the ones who wrote with characters and diacritical marks that might have been from Egypt or Chaldea. This is just one of many subtleties for the discerning reader that tie the Fabius story and the Mormon story together into one long epic saga, which is Manuscripts Found. Listen to how Spalding and Fabius abridge the great battle of Gehenna. Quote, "As both emperors had agreed to the suspension of arms for the purpose of burying the remains of these heroic warriors, 10,000 men from each army entered the field and began the mournful employment. They dug holes about 3 feet deep and in a circular form, and of about 20 or 30 feet in diameter. In these they deposited the bodies of their deceased heroes, and then raised over them large mounds of earth. The bodies of the chiefs who had fallen were carried to their respective armies and buried with all the solemnities of woe. Over them they raised prodigious mounds of earth, which will remain for ages as monuments to commemorate the valiant feats of these heroes and the great battle of Gehenna." Now, if that story doesn't sound like the Book of Mormon to you, then you might want to read it again, this time inserting a couple of "and it came to passes" and a "for behold" here and there. Stopping the battle to bury their dead? Check. 10,000 men from each army? Check. Piling up huge heaps of bodies and covering them so as to make large mounds? Check. Notice how Spalding has the chiefs buried in their own, probably bigger mounds as monuments. And what do we have here? Right in between the Kishkush and Kishkamen rivers, where the kings are supposed to live, we see the mounds that serve as monuments not far from the battlefield. How do we know that this field was a battlefield in Spalding's mind? Well, just look at the name, Colonel Bouquet's Field. For you history buffs out there, this was the site of the infamous Battle of Bushy Run. Recall that to end the siege on Fort Pitt, Colonel Bouquet ordered the men under his command, in a temporary truce, to show mercy to the Native Americans by distributing smallpox-infested blankets. Later, on this very field, they stood no chance as the white men robbed them of their land and spread the work of death on both sides. And thus we see how Spalding, rather like Homer, Virgil, and Macpherson, is inspired by an infamous modern-day battle story and uses the setting and even some of the names to rewrite ancient history, in this case to explain what the mounds might contain and why. We know Spalding was fascinated with their contents, sometimes attending the opening of mounds to see what might be revealed. He puts his hellish Battle of Gehenna in a field adjacent to existing and map-worthy burial mounds and along a river that gives its name Kishkamen to, quote, the most ferocious band of murderers that ever disgraced humanity, close quote. As we know from other parts of the story, those robbers, or bandits, if you will, cowardly retreat into their strongholds and hiding places in the great mountains above. We know from the Fabius story that those mountains were here, literally this part of the Allegheny Ridge. And we know from the Romance of Celeste that the Great Mountain, where the climax takes place, is also geographically right here. How do we know that? In Spalding's chapter, titled Journey to the Allegheny Mountains, Philander says, quote, we were now on our journey, and the blue summits of the Allegheny in the eastern horizon reminded me most forcibly of a childish notion I once entertained of the distant boundaries. Clearly, he is heading east while facing the great mountain to fight against the robbers that are hiding there. Quote, there are 3 routes to the mountain where they all terminate in one, which had obtained a variety of appellatives, such as Hardscrabble, the Needle's Eye, and the Deep, or by some, the Dragon's Hiding Place. This common place of termination in the story is called the Mountain of Death. So, this is clearly the setting where the struggle between the whites and the darker-skinned Native Americans turned into the French and Indian War, which was highly influential for Spalding as it was an area explored by his hero, George Washington. It is clearly the setting for the hellish Battle of Gehenna, in which a ferocious band of robbers and murderers is destroyed on a field which produced these mounds as a result, so Fabius says. It is also the setting of the ancestors of the people that dwelt here in the Fabius story. Those ancestors are Egyptian/Chaldean writing people in the Mormon story, with Kishkamen now leading a different band of robbers and murderers, always hiding in the mountains above and coming down to make war on the civilized people here, probably at this same battlefield, which is bordered by the river Kishkamen in Spalding's mind. This is how Spalding anchored his fiction to real-life details as he composed manuscripts found, which of course included both the Fabius story and the Mormon story. It is also the setting for the climax of the Romance of Celeste, from which the river Kishon, allegorically speaking, washes away the bloodstains of the robbers and then receded to its present channel, which, for fun, alludes to the Kishkamenitas River, which of course flows out of these mountain caves. You can imagine how fun it was for Spalding to write fiction that would also explain why it seemed like a mountaintop was missing from specifically this part of the Allegheny Ridge. I said it in my book, I said it at Sunstone 2024, and on every podcast that I have given, and I'm going to keep saying it. The best way to truly understand the Book of Mormon is to understand the mindset of its most original author. We do that by carefully analyzing all of Spalding's writings in great depth, including the Romance of Celeste, which no one besides me is doing today. Nonetheless, doing so can teach us which books influenced him the most, what themes he cared about, where he got his details, and what drama moved him to compose such epic and romantic fiction. Along the way, we get to figure out what Spalding envisioned a 15 days journey for a Nephite to look like. We know that he meant for the Nephites or the Jaredites to land in North America west of the Allegheny Mountains. We can tease out why he played with modern-day place names, altering them to seem more Hebraic so that they might suggestively tie into the Bible, but with some phonological drift to give it a flair of authenticity. When we read Spalding carefully, we don't even have to speculate about whether that is what he is doing. Point in fact, in the Fabius story, Spalding breaks the fourth wall to tell the reader why he retroactively commingles real place names with fictitious person names. Quote, in the history given of these nations by my author, meaning swear to God, you will find nothing but will correspond with the natural sentiments we should form upon viewing the innumerable remains of antiquity, which are scattered over an extensive country, which is evidence of the author's impartiality and veracity. In other words, Spalding's impartiality and veracity. But if any should pretend that the whole story is fictitious or fabulous, I would endeavor to publish a translation of every particular circumstance mentioned by our author, but that would produce a volume too expensive for the general class of readers." Close quote. Spalding is both cheeky and playful when breaking this fourth wall. He essentially says, "In this new Native American epic history, swear to God, you will find evidence that it is true. Just look at the landforms scattered here and there. The person and place names in the story are pretty similar to those landforms in real life, especially the rivers. So I must be telling you the truth. But if you think I'm making the whole thing up, well, I could explain the rest of the details, which would convince you that these stories are true, but that would be expensive." Now think about how Moroni's promise at the end of the Book of Mormon involves Moroni breaking the fourth wall and asking the reader to look for evidence through faith and prayer of the author's authenticity and veracity. Imagine how that might have resonated with a restorationist preacher like Sidney Rigdon. Now I'm going to return to the promise I made that I would show you a better linguistic tree for Kishkumen than what Mr. Vogel has championed. Consistent with his prior pattern, Spalding found a type of the ancient Kishon River in his nearby Kishkamenitas River, from which, through the schwa sound, he derived Kishkumen by taking off the Native American ending. Looking for building blocks on which to create names, he then decomposed Kishkumen into Kish and Kumen. Kish he made into a prefix, a full name, and a suffix, see Akish and Riplikish. Incidentally, I think that Spalding imagined Kish to mean evil, as if it were an inversion of the biblical Kishon. Recall that Riplikish in the Jaredite story is also evil, as his name might suggest. It is a combination of Ripple and Kish. Swapping the syllables in Kuman, he generates Ankum with the appropriate vowel and consonant shifts that one would expect to see while moving a character back in time by a millennium or two. He puts cum as both cum and kum in his toolbox as a prefix, middle syllable, and suffix, as evidenced by these words. Note especially Moriankumer, Tiankum, and Ripliankum. The jump to Kumenonhai from Kumen is obvious. Spalding loves to use on and high as suffixes, even together. I'll explain later from whence probably cometh more, mer, and ta. If you study these matters carefully, I think you'll quite agree that Joseph Smith did not permute Book of Mormon names during a one-take, straight-through, 60-day composition dictation process. I think you'll also agree that Smith did not compose the proper nouns nor create the plot. No, Spalding constructed a bank of prefixes, roots, and suffixes drawing from literature that he wanted to emulate, from the Bible, and from the local environment, including rivers. Then he played around with them the way that Macpherson did. When Spalding sat down to compose manuscripts found, he seems to have written an overall outline first, and then sprinkled in his newly named characters throughout with a scattered pattern and some phonological drift to make it seem more authentic. Only later did it get transmogrified into what Smith read or dictated to his scribes. Okay, I know that was quite a long digression on Kishkumen, but it just goes to show how much work it takes to undo even a paragraph of defensive and apologetic reasoning. With that behind us, we're back to Nephi.
What makes the Nephi reference in Maccabees interesting is that it is followed in the next chapter by a prologue of several verses about abridging records, reminding one of Mormon and Nephi.
Again, there is no evidence that Smith was any kind of Bible scholar when he was 22, with a very subpar education, having roamed the countryside looking for buried treasure for years. There is, however, undeniable evidence in all of Spalding's writings that he was extremely literate on the Old Testament. If anyone was influenced by this chapter and the idea that abridgments of other ancient records might have made their way into sacred texts, that person was more likely to have been Spalding than Smith. In terms of abridging records specifically, Fabius abridges his story onto 28 rolls of parchment that he leaves explicitly in a cave to be found by someone who pries up a large flat stone with a lever, which should sound familiar. In the Romance of Celeste, Philander meets another Florentine hero, Lord Duncan, who relates that he found a parchment roll so old and from another civilization that almost no one could read it, which explained how in ancient times, quote, England was nearly overrun with robbers who infested every town and village in the countryside. Their retreat was so securely invisible that the king offered great rewards to anyone who would discover their stronghold. That's not too dissimilar from the Nephites meeting the Mulekites, who relate that they found some plates from an older civilization that almost no one could read. Spalding didn't have to reuse his ideas from his earlier Mormon story when writing the Romance of Celeste, but he did. Through Philander as a narrator, Spalding, who models Philander on his days as a youth, also says that the Florentine heroes have been fighting bands of robbers and secret combinations from the beginning. Quote, there have been robbers in every age from Adam down to the present. Close quote. He discussed them during the time of Noah, pretending that they were the true cause of the flood, and even in the Avon Hills above Bath, England. That should be enough for now about Spalding having his characters read abridged stories about robbers. Now let's focus more on the name Nephi itself. If Spalding knew that the name of Kircher's made-up source was Nephi, and I think he did, either because he was very well read himself or because he had learned about it through his Dartmouth education, probably under Professor John Smith, he might have looked up Nephi in his Bible dictionary and read the foregoing chapters in Maccabees, which could have reinforced his choice to make Kircher's Nephi the name of his made-up character too, whose record would also get abridged and included in his magnum opus, Manuscripts Found. But let's take a step back and ask why Kircher might have chosen Nephi, seemingly out of whole cloth, to be the name of his made-up source, which, as we know, got him transferred to Rome and punched his ticket into the Republic of Letters as both a translator and a professor of Oriental languages. To the Catholics, Maccabees is not an apocryphal book, but a part of their canon, and choosing a name that had only appeared in Catholic scripture might have been clever on Kircher's part. You see, he was into what we now call Western esotericism, trying to rectify Catholicism with the Kabbalah by unlocking the ancient wisdom of Egyptian hieroglyphs. He needed a name for his made-up source that could passably have lived in Egypt centuries before, which of course meant that his made-up source needed to have at least one Arabic name. But he also needed a name that suggested a depth of Jewish culture, as well as the language of intellectuals, which was Greek. Kircher settled on Rabbi Barachias Nephi, with Rabbi being a Jewish title, Barachias being the Greek version of Berechiah, he who was slain between the temple and the altar, and Nephi being an uncommon but recognizably Arabic name whose cognate fortuitously appeared in Catholic-specific scripture. In the end, it doesn't really matter why Kircher chose Nephi to be the name of his fabrication, but it did make him the envy of every gentleman of letters and quite the cautionary tale for any aspiring linguist for at least 100 years. This Turkish Arab, currently shown on your screen, was similarly named Nephi, but with an F instead of a PH. He was a famous Turkish poet, satirist, and prophet, born 29 years before Kircher was born, whose real name was Omer, which perhaps coincidentally, and perhaps not coincidentally, was the name of a Jaredite king in the Book of Mormon. It is, of course, possible that Kircher was so impressed by this Nephi's prowess as a poet and by his facility with Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Latin that it reinforced his choice to employ Nephi as the name of his made-up source. In his video, Vogel acknowledged that
he certainly was the most learned man among the Turks, skilled not only in Arabic, but he also understood Latin. When any difficult matter occurred, it was customary for Rami to consult Nephi Ogli and carry his opinion to the vizier as his own.
FYI, the word is vizier, not visor.
Vizier. Vizier.
Of course, this Nephi with an F is properly pronounced Nephi in Turkish, but so is Kircher's Nephi. I don't think anyone is going to seriously suggest this is where Joseph Smith got the idea for his character Nephi, because it's too remote and would require an elaborate scheme to make it work.
Neither have I suggested it. I agree with Mr. Vogel that 22-year-old Joseph Smith didn't know a lick about Kircher's Nephi or this Ottoman Nephi or anything related to the Arab world, the Oriental languages, or antiquity for that matter. But is there any evidence, without an elaborate scheme to make it work, that Spalding had studied famous Arabs from such or earlier centuries? In fact, there is. About 80% of the way through the Romance of Celeste, the narrator compares and contrasts the qualities of great leaders like Napoleon Bonaparte and George Washington. In that monologue, he casually discusses the mighty battle betwixt the legions of Tamerlane, the great Turkish Mogul, and those of Sultan Bayezid, an Albanian Ottoman of Constantinople. About them, Spalding's narrator says, quote, "And although their names will probably descend to the last generation, emblazoned on the great list of bloody heroes, yet they were men whose success depended so very diminutively upon their own personal greatness, and so abundantly upon the warlike character of their soldiers, that we may safely conclude that the great men of the earth are but fictitious characters attached to real names." In addition to altering the legacies and identities of real-world Arab men, Spalding also makes them up out of whole cloth. One such fictitious character from the Romance of Celeste is an Albanian sheik. A sheik is the chief or head of an Arab tribe or village. This particular Albanian sheik is the leader of another band of mountainous robbers. Quote, "A few miles farther, the storm had not been felt, and the sameness of the surrounding scenery permitted us to review the subject of our Albanian sheik, or chief of the horse thief confederacy." Close quote. His American pseudonym in the story is Michael McIntosh, but his bandits call him King Al-Intosh. Intosh, if you don't know, translates to chief in Gaelic, such that the Scottish name Macintosh literally means son of the chief, which is another allusion to Macpherson, as we shall see. In a very Kishkaman-like speech, he says, quote, "I, your own acknowledged chief, Al-Intosh ben Stiletto, dreading the oath and steel of every true son of Barabbas, command you to mark the house with cinders, the inmates with Constantine's motto, and the specie, plate, and jewelry with secrecy." Close quote. To me, this is reminiscent of an outsider working his way up to being the chief of the Gadianton robbers, Gadianton being the successor of Kishkaman. If you didn't know, the stiletto was first developed in late 15th century Italy and was the preferred weapon of robbers and assassins for its ability to pierce its way through the gaps in plate armor. Notice how routinely Spalding takes diverse names, even foreign names, and alters them with prefixes and modifiers. Here, al means the, and ben means son of. Incidentally, Kircher sometimes calls his Barachias Nephi Barachias Alba Nephi, which means Barachias, son of Nephi. His full name and title would then be Barachias Nephi Alba Nephi, meaning Barachias Nephi, the son of Nephi. At one point in the Romance of Celeste, Philander tries to free his uncle, who had been abducted by a band of robbers who are hiding themselves in the cave system connected to the Mountain of Death. He says to his wife that, quote, traveling is an instructive school because it informs us of what the world is. The world is one thing and books are another. Books change, not because men change, but because men change them. And a book that does not represent its own era as the most glorious is consigned to dust and the moth. So it is with the traveler, while he endeavors to fill up the void of his imagination by embarking boldly upon the tide of real life. And now that my benevolent intention of rescuing my uncle from inevitable assassination occupied my whole mind and exercised the most latent energies of my ingenuity, I could but anticipate a complete triumph, having already a clue to the enemy's designs. Close quote. From these passages, it should be clear why Spalding so freely and boldly revises history in all of his stories, including the Romance of Celeste, the Fabius story, and the Mormon story. He intimates that true history is one thing, and that the history recorded in books is quite another. For him, even true historical characters are fictitious to some significant extent, like the Arab rulers in Emir Tamerlane and Sultan Bayezid. So why not embrace that idea more fully? Men are good at changing books, he says, because for a story to descend to the last generation, it must represent its own era as the most glorious. If not, it will be consigned to dust and to the moth. The Book of Mormon exists today and will probably exist in some form for all time, precisely because Spalding knew this idea to be true, and he acted on it. Spalding is literally telling us, in his own stories, some of which include made-up Arab characters like Al-Intash ben Stiletto and Nephi, that his reason for writing epic literature, including what later got turned into the Book of Mormon, was not because he believed it truthfully portrayed what happened in ancient America, but because by telling it the way that Homer told the Iliad, that Virgil told the Aeneid, and that Macpherson told his oceanic poetry, it might have a chance at immortality, which at some level is what all writers want, for their manuscripts to be read and not to be lost, and if lost for a time, to later be manuscripts found. This is precisely what Spalding's close friend Nahum Howard related in 1833 after Mormon missionaries came to Conneaut, Ohio. Quote, I frequently saw Spalding at his house and also at my house. He was writing a history of that race of people, and afterwards frequently showed me his writings, which I read. I have lately read the Book of Mormon and believe it to be the same as Spalding wrote. He told me that he intended to get his writings published in Pittsburgh, and he thought that in 1 century from that time it would be believed as much as any other history. Close quote. In stark contrast, Joseph Smith's education, experience, and exposure could not hold a candle to those of Solomon Spalding, especially as touching the 1600s and the Arab world. It is much more likely that Spalding got out a map, as he did with his Fabius story, and had his Nephi follow a course from Jerusalem southward along the Red Sea, turning east somewhere near modern-day Yemen, camping at a place called Bountiful, sailing to the west coast of the North American continent, and moving westwardly from there to the Ohio, as was said of the ancestors of the Ohian people in the Fabius story. Of course, I don't think that Nahum was a bullseye, but if it was, Spalding did it, not Joseph Smith.
Was Joseph Smith influenced by Kircher or the Apocrypha, or neither? One or both have to be a coincidence. It is far more likely that Kircher is the coincidence.
22-year-old Joseph Smith was influenced by neither Kircher nor the Apocrypha, and it certainly does not follow that one or both have to be a coincidence. Equally or more important is whether Solomon Spalding was influenced by Kircher or the Apocrypha or both. Here again, it does not follow that one or both have to be a coincidence. Lots of highly educated people at top universities were well read on both. However, most people were not well read on either. Athanasius Kircher and his Nephi were certainly not in the milieu of Joseph Smith or the general milieu of rural western New York in the late 1820s, but they were in the wheelhouse of Solomon Spaulding and his highly esteemed Professor of Oriental Languages, a title that both Kircher and Professor John Smith had adopted. People who love to compose fiction and read their stories in public places, as Spaulding often did, tend to have good reasons for choosing the names of their main characters. Notice I said good reasons, plural, and not just a good reason, singular. Not always, but often, an important name is selected from its runner-up alternatives precisely because it elegantly brings together multiple ideas, not just one or two. Take Sirius Black, for instance. Sirius is the brightest star in the sky, and he serves as a bright light in Harry's life. At the same time, Black is void of light, and Black was the surname of a dark wizarding family. J.K. Rowling showcasing the contrast between light and dark in the same person was clever, but it goes far beyond that. Sirius is a star in the constellation Canis Major. Canis means dog. So she has Sirius Black as an animagus turn into a black dog. Does at least one of those motivations have to be a coincidence? Of course not. Kircher, Spaulding, and Rowling are tapestry weavers. They wove ideas together, creating complicated patterns and themes to please the mind's eye and entertain the especially educated. Some of Spaulding's poetry, songs, and prose in The Romance of Celeste are quite compelling, very well woven, and sprinkled with allusions to literature everywhere. Mr. Vogel insisting that each proper name in Spaulding's works, including the Mormon story, can only have one cause or influence is surface-level thinking that hinders one's ability to behold the entire tapestry. Nephi and Mormon, the first and last bookending characters in the Book of Mormon, I contend, are very clever and well-chosen names. Beyond the threads I have already explained, they both allude to infamous professors of Oriental languages who, in the 1630s, made up their sources, wrote pseudepigrapha, tried to get away with it, got caught, and were viciously caricatured in the media as a result.
Why would someone, Professor Smith or Spaulding, intentionally use a name associated with a well-known historical forgery while creating a forgery themselves?
First of all, Mr. Vogel shouldn't mischaracterize what Spaulding or Professor John Smith was doing. Neither one was a forger. True, Kircher had lied about possessing Nephi's works, saying that they were the key to unlocking Egyptian through Coptic, but that did not make him a forger. Forgery is the act of producing a document or a passable copy of a document, which Kircher never did. He just lied about having it. Likewise, Spaulding wrote epic fiction and with biblical hooks, but that is not a forgery either. It's a composition. But on to the substance of Mr. Vogel's question. Why would Spaulding use the name of a source that had been made up by an infamous and almost forgotten antiquarian? One reason is dramatic irony, which is arguably one of the biggest and best tools a writer has in his literary toolbox. Nephi is probably the most perfect name that an educated antiquarian could choose if his purpose was to write biblical fan fiction that appeared to be ancient American scripture. In the story, Spaulding has his Nephi engrave the account of his life in Egyptian characters, which is later called Reformed Egyptian, precisely because Kircher claimed that his Nephi could translate an intermediate Egyptian language halfway between ancient Egyptian and modern Coptic. Kircher pretended that his Rabbi Berechius Nephi was of mixed cultural heritage, being part Jewish and part Arab, speaking both Hebrew and Arabic, and able to translate Egyptian. Moreover, Spaulding incorporated more than just the name Nephi. He layered onto his character mixed cultural heritage, befitting a man who would lead his family through Arabia, in the story of course, and even made him large in stature, as the similar sounding word Nephilim might imply. Spalding, like a good tapestry weaver, was layered like this in all his writings. Smith had no such capability, which I will discuss a little later. It makes all the sense in the world that Spalding would choose the name Nephi for such a character. Even so, let's assume temporarily that Nephi was not an intentional Kircherism. Mr. Vogel's argument that the character Nephi could only have been influenced by the Apocrypha is still better suited to Spalding than it is to Smith. On the other hand, assuming that Nephi was a Kircherism, it's hard to reason why Smith would include such an undermining detail, even if he were somehow educated enough to have studied Kircher in the first place, which he wasn't. Again, Kircher's Nephi was nowhere in Smith's milieu.
This is a good reason to believe that Kircherisms aren't in the Book of Mormon. Assuming Joseph Smith is the author of the Book of Mormon, it makes more sense to conclude that what Nielsen calls Kircherisms are in fact either coincidence or his own inventions.
I'm so glad that Mr. Vogel included this statement. It really demonstrates one of the problems here. He rejects evidence that challenges Smith's sole authorship only after he assumes Smith's sole authorship and then comes to an absurdity. But he concludes his indirect proof without properly discharging his assumption, which error is sometimes called affirming the consequent. Mr. Vogel's corrected argument is shown on the right. Here, sole authorship is assumed as part of a conditional proof. Then, Kircherisms are assumed for the purpose of making an indirect argument, sometimes called reductio ad absurdum. After a contradiction is reached, Kircherisms are negated. But that is an interim conclusion that is still under the undischarged assumption. Discharging the condition properly generates a conditional consequent. The contrapositive of that statement, with double negation, follows. This has been my argument all along, that if Kircherisms are real, then they undermine sole authorship theories. The argument on the right is valid and sound if all the premises turn out to be true. The argument on the left is neither valid nor sound. Let's move on to the next Kircherism.
Probably Nielsen's most intriguing Kircherism is his discussion of Kircher's invention of various glass balls filled with mineral oil, within which a spindle mysteriously moved to point out the time, day of week, letters of the alphabet, direction of the wind, or a person's horoscope, which Kircher claimed worked by spiritual magnetism.
Kircher produced hundreds of such balls and filled his museum with them. Most of them had pointers, spindles, and writing on their sides. The pointers were sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes angelic, and sometimes inanimate. Kircher would then tell a patron in his museum to hold a ball in his hands to charge it up with his spiritual energy. He would then invite the patron to ponder on a question for which they might want an answer. A nearby but hidden spinning bar magnet, usually under the tables, would cause the spindles to rotate sporadically and eventually settle on a position that would point to writing that appeared on the side of the globe. These balls were the 17th century version of a magic 8-ball today, and they were very popular with the visitors. Here is how Kircher scholar Jocelyn Godwin describes them. Quote, "Glass globes contain Kircher's favorite device of magnetized pointing figures, which rotate as though by magic, but actually because a magnet is turning the column beneath them. Once he had found that a figure suspended inside a glass globe could be turned by an unseen magnet, the stage magician in him took over."
Nielsen compares this to Lehi's Liahona, a compass-like instrument described as a hollow brass ball of curious workmanship containing 2 spindles, which worked by faith. Kircher's balls had brass parts, but they were not brass balls. and Lehi's brass ball was not filled with mineral oil.
An author can be influenced by a famous object and still alter it somewhat to fit the purposes of his or her fiction. Perhaps an analogy would help Mr. Vogel here. It would be wrong, for example, to conclude that a writer of Harry Potter fan fiction couldn't have been influenced by wand lore simply because the core of his new main character's wand didn't specifically contain a dragon heartstring, a unicorn hair, or a phoenix feather. Be that as it may, here is a ball among Kircher's exhibits that is made of brass only, which the patron would hold in his hands to charge up with his spiritual energy. In reality, it would absorb body heat, which would then expand the air in the chamber beneath it, and then through hidden mechanisms, the spindle in the adjacent glass globe would eventually point to the answer. Kircher had many variations on this theme. All of them had some artifice and misdirection, but it was always in the service of the greater good, a religious object lesson. Some of them were filled with mineral oil, yes, and some of them were not, which I mentioned in my book. Mr. Vogel also tries to create distance between the Liahona and Kircher's balls by suggesting that the Liahona worked by faith, not spiritual magnetism. He forgets that Kircher wrote his doctoral thesis on how all forms of magnetism, spiritual and electric, were manifestations of faith. In fact, he was the first person to merge the concepts into the term electromagnetism, which is obviously still used today. Kircher even explained that it was Peter's faith that generated a spiritually magnetic field strong enough to counter Earth's magnetic field long enough that he could walk on water, but only until his faith wavered. Spiritual magnetism, working only until faith wavers, is a parallel that strengthens, not weakens, the connection to Spalding's Liahona.
Kircher's balls had various functions, but none were used to point out directions of travel because they didn't work independent of the box on which they sat, which concealed the magnets and mechanism that moved the spindles, as plainly depicted in Kircher's illustrations.
This is just more of the same. Yes, Kircher's exhibits often presented themselves as functioning ethereally rather than mechanically, but that was understood, and frankly was part of their charm. Mr. Vogel suggests that Spalding could not have been influenced by Kircher's balls because they weren't portable enough to point out directions of travel far away from the hidden bar magnet. Mr. Vogel doesn't realize that whether the balls actually worked independent of the box on which they sat is irrelevant. The illusion, however, that they could work independent of the box on which they sat is relevant. Regardless, this particular exhibit from Kircher's museum does seem to point out the direction of travel, connecting the direction of the wind, the time of day, a globe with writing on its sides, a pointer, a spindle, a hidden bar magnet, and a literal ship in the background, all of which I discussed in my book.
In the Book of Mormon, there are 2 spindles, and one pointed the way whether we should go into the wilderness, like a compass. The text even refers to the brass ball as a compass. Alma says, "Our fathers called it Liahona, which is, being interpreted, a compass." Presumably, one spindle pointed to magnetic north, and the other toward the direction of travel.
The first 2 sentences are accurate, but the last one is fun yet harmless speculation on Mr. Vogel's part. Nothing in the text would suggest that one spindle pointed to magnetic north. But sure, why not? Some apologists like Don Bradley have published that one spindle pointed the way they should go and the other pointed to where to find food. Other apologists argue that both spindles pointed to where they should go. None of these speculations matter, of course, but perhaps if Smith hadn't lost the first 116 pages, Spalding's descriptions would have come through more clearly. Vogel's point here, I think, is that Kircher's balls were, to Vogel, not literally compass-like enough to be considered a spiritually magnetic compass. I disagree. Some of Kircher's curious balls were typically more focused on providing spiritual direction than physical direction, yes, but they all had more than enough physicality with their pointers and spindles to qualify as a spiritually magnetic compass.
But Lehi's Liahona combined both science and miracle. It worked by faith and stopped working when Lehi's group experienced disharmony. Kircher, according to Nielsen, claimed his spindles worked by spiritual forces, electric forces, and magnetic forces, when actually they worked by hidden magnets, like a magician's stage illusion or parlor trick. Such talk was nothing but misdirection.
I can't tell whether Mr. Vogel is saying here that such talk was Kircher being mischievous or me being mischievous, which he accuses me of being more than once elsewhere in the video. But to the point, Kircher loved Baroque spectacle, and if that meant using a little misdirection to accomplish his righteous purposes, well, he was fine with that. Like the Liahona, Kircher's balls also pretended to combine both science and miracle. Kircher tied the efficacy of spiritual magnetism to faith repeatedly. For him, magnetism was literally and figuratively a radiation of personal righteousness. It is not surprising that Spalding, influenced by Kircher, also combined both science and miracle in other ways too, which, in the Romance of Celeste, he called ethereal science and heavenly science. Philander says of his wife Josephine, "I was satisfied, however, that she had advanced as far in the ethereal science as I had." When Philander preaches a restored gospel to Lamech, a Lunarian, he says that Lamech, quote, was learning and making great strides in the ethereal sciences, close quote. Preparing to transcend the earth, we learn, can be exhausting, which causes mere mortals to tire, quote, after suffering so long the strict electrical discipline of the ethereal convocation. Describing one such convocation at Albany, New York, the Florentines there present, quote, partook in a great degree of that ethereal and electrical character which was so wonderfully displayed, close quote. In a soliloquy, a character pines for the day in which Earth's atmosphere will be, quote, as ethereal, electrical, and intellectual as that of Jupiter, close quote. He goes on, but oh, the furies of the earth, the corrupting spirit of avarice, how hast thou made desolate that Eden of unpolluted bliss? Clearly, Spalding loved to combine science and miracle, the electrical and the ethereal, and not just with his Liahona. As it turned out, Spalding worked spiritual electromagnetism into other fictional, metallic, handheld objects as well. The Florentine heroes often find themselves in dark situations, not just in caves, where they pull out different kinds of handheld lamps, which, when specified, are made of tin or gold. Well, at least they have the appearance of gold. Some are regular oil-trimmed lamps, but some are electric or have ethereal fuel. On one such occasion, just before a wedding, the Florentine heroes reflect on the hope of marital bliss, and suddenly the multitude of electric lamps get as bright as the noonday sun. Quote, at this reflection, the brilliancy of the lamps increased till their light could vie with the summer's noon. Close quote. Here Spalding embraces the idea that righteous thoughts can cause electric objects to become supercharged, which of course wanes as the spiritual moment passes. At another Florentine reception, quote, the glowing lamps with high electric power were made here subservient to thought, close quote. Again, there is a link between righteous thoughts and how effectively they function. Spalding writes that, quote, the exceeding great brilliancy of their lamps is only made possible because they have learned of heaven's science, close quote. Throughout the Romance of Celeste, Spalding contrasts the light that shines from the lamps of the robbers and from the mortals who haven't yet become full-fledged Florentines with the light that shines from those who have basically transcended the test of their mortality. Another innovation, powered by spiritual electromagnetism, involves levitating stagecoaches, which the narrator calls electric cars, which the Florentine heroes would charge up with their spiritual energy. Quote, we knelt, And when we arose, our cars, like the fiery chariot of Elijah, were blazing at our feet. We looked, and behold, the beautiful planet was dropping like a plummet beneath us." Close quote. Later, after resting on the moon, which was on their way to Venus, the writers did so again. Quote, "Here we sung and prayed and rejoiced and gave thanks to God for that ethereal and divine unction by whose electrical agency we are enabled to mount the starry theater of God's own handiwork." In another part, the narrator describes one of the cars, saying that it was "a splendid car of locomotive power, electric as a thunderbolt, yet subject to the will and inclination of a prince ethereal such as he." Close quote. Here's another quote. "And blazing with the radiant light, and heated with his own true fire, our chariots mounted up as though the quickening breath and fiat of Jehovah now had come." In a mighty gathering of Florentines, Philander says that "the upper regions of the air were now luminous with fiery chariots, whose electricity and electromagnetic influence operated so exactly in accordance with that of our own cars that blah blah blah." If desired, at will, the operator of the flying stagecoach could even disguise it as a cloud as it flew through the sky, thus ingeniously managing his electromagnetic apparatus so as to produce all the attendant phenomena of a thunderstorm all around us. These mind-controlled, righteousness-powered electric cars are sometimes called chariots of fire, ethereal chariots, fiery chariots, and electrified chariots. They were discovered by the Florentine heroes after journeying through a cave system which was far beneath the stronghold of a mountain-dwelling band of robbers. Eventually, the Florentines find an ancient American temple which was protected from the robbers' infiltration by an enchantment. Near the temple, there was a vast arched ceiling above an emerald forest that was several acres large. In the middle of this huge hemisphere, the Florentines found a raised-up octagon above which there was a large, rotating, levitating amphitheater built by the ancients before the flood. Looking up while seated in this amphitheater, participants saw what today we would call an IMAX presentation of the history of the Earth, kind of like the Vision of John. Inspiring displays, including great battle scenes, were unfolded on bedazzling jewels that served as pixels. Quote, "Our eyes opened to behold the glory and splendor of Jerusalem, the pride of Europe, and the boast of Eastern India, all transplanted to a Florentine cavern in the United States of America, where, with all their brilliant and sparkling and blazing gems and jewels, they only vied in vain to outshine the old gentleman's countenance when he arose to speak." And what caused this amphitheater to levitate and rotate? Spiritual electromagnetism powered by prayer and song. And what caused the underground IMAX theater to light up so brilliantly? The righteously charged up sword of George Washington, of course, when inserted, like a key, into a diamond hearth, kind of like pulling King Arthur's sword out of the stone, but in reverse, or like the insertion of a memory crystal into Superman's Fortress of Solitude. Quote, "He thrust his faithful sword, its blade was steel, and like the hand that wielded it, it was quite electric. And as it glided o'er the diamond hearth, the silent spell was broken, with tinkling blade that echoed long and loud, and filled a chain of caverns long and wide with sounds melodious. And rolling back with double melodies, it filled all our ears with music most prophetic. And as the diamond hearth had long, long slept in darkness, and so long had been untouched, its own electric fire now kindled up, as if by magic, and all the cavern shone with light ineffable. The walls of this apartment were composed of solid rock, and in form it was almost a perfect hemisphere, making it quite practicable for a person skilled in the laws of magnetism and electricity to perform wonders in imitation of the stupendous operations of nature. The allusion to Athanasius Kircher being skilled in the laws of magnetism and electricity, performing wonders in his Wunderkammer in imitation of the stupendous operations of nature, is right there for those who have eyes to read. Notice also that we have a hand that was quite electric, perhaps reminding us of Nephi's electric hands that reached out and shocked Laman and Lemuel. Somewhat similar is a dramatic reenactment on the planet Jupiter in which the Florentine heroes charge up their chariots with spiritual electromagnetism and then charge into a beast containing 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast reared his head and rattled his horns and pounced upon us like a tiger upon her prey. But we brushed him with electric shocks from our chariot wheels till he roared out most lustily." Close quote. Spalding recycled and mutated many ideas across all his books because they were his ideas and he liked them. And thus we see that Spalding was quite influenced by Kircher's spiritual electromagnetism and played with it extensively in his fiction. Incidentally, in Messiah 20, we have lions for their prey instead of a tiger upon her prey, for what that's worth. But how do we know that it was Kircher's spiritual electromagnetism, not just any old spiritual electromagnetism, that influenced Spalding? In Spalding's romance, one of the oldest and wisest of the Florentine heroes is a man named Demidicus. The text tells us that he is, quote, "the learned and banished prince of Florence," and that his sainted name has been echoed in that great IMAX theater ever since the revival of letters and the liberal arts under the glorious auspices of the illustrious house of de' Medici. In English, we often say Medici, but that's not correct. It should be Medici. If you're not familiar with the de' Medici family, they were the incredibly wealthy banking family from Florence that sponsored so much art, scholarship, and architecture over 2 centuries that they are generally credited with having fueled and funded the Renaissance. They famously sponsored the architecture of Michelangelo, the works of Leonardo da Vinci, the art of Botticelli, and the writings of Athanasius Kircher. The following paragraph comes from Etruscan Dreams, Athanasius Kircher, Medici Patronage, and Tuscan Friendship, co-authored by Paula Finland at Stanford University. Quote, "In June 1658, the German Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher, famed throughout Europe for his dazzling array of publications that claimed to unlock all the most urgent scholarly mysteries of his age, sent his most recent works, Ecstatic Journey No. 2 and Examination of Plague, to Grand Duke Ferdinando II de' Medici, explicitly seeking his patronage. Recalling the long-standing legacy of the Medici family's support of scholarship for over 2 centuries, Kircher assured the Grand Duke that, inner quote, after the death of Emperor Ferdinand, patron of glorious memory, in no other princely court would they go to lodge more willingly than in that of your most serene highness, close inner quote. He was referring to Ferdinand III, who bankrolled so many of Kircher's publications and provided the Jesuit scholar with a handsome stipend until his death in 1657, close quote. To summarize, Ferdinand III de' Medici financed Kircher's Iter Ecstaticum Celeste, Ecstatic Journey Through the Heavens, which is the first of Kircher's only 2 works of fiction. The second is Ecstatic Journey No. 2, which was a sequel and a journey to the center of the Earth instead of being a tour of the solar system. When Ferdinand III died, Kircher used excessive flattery, as per usual, to induce his old patron's living relative, the Grand Duke, to continue with the sponsorships, which he did. In the first Ecstatic Journey, literally a romance of the heavens, Kircher travels to Jupiter and beyond being guided by an angel. Why is this relevant? In the Romance of Celeste, Spalding makes Demidicus a transcended being who saves Philander from harm more than once and goes to Jupiter with him, where we learn that Demidicus is, quote, the adopted son of George Washington, who had sent Domiticus to Earth on a Florentine mission to save Philander and Josephine in the first place. So, in case it isn't obvious, Spalding names one of the most important heroes in his Romance of the Heavens after the family that bankrolled Athanasius Kircher's Romance of the Heavens. Incidentally, Spalding quotes or refers to other members of the Medici family as well, including Pope Leo X, who is one of 4 popes to hail from the Medici family. There are other similarities between Kircher's Romance of the Heavens and Spalding's Romance of the Heavens, which will all come out when I'm done with my current project. Notice how Spalding reuses or recycles the idea of banished princes. Mulek in the Book of Mormon is supposedly a prince, being the son of the Old Testament Zedekiah. King Zedekiah and his sons are historical, according to the Bible, but 2 Kings 25:7 says that all of Zedekiah's sons were slain. In that, Spalding saw an opportunity to create a fun biblical hook for his fan fiction, with the banished Prince Mulek ending up in America. Spalding does the same thing with Domiticus. The Medici family is historical, so true to form, Spalding creates a son that no one has ever heard of, banishes him, and has him end up in America. Here's another one. In the Romance of Celeste, everyone thought that only Noah and his family survived the flood, but Spalding creates another family and another boat that no one knew existed. He rewrites the story of how and why the flood actually happened while creating a hook for a new race of survivors that no one has ever heard about. Basically, the Florentines learn that God had calculated, long before the actual flood, for a huge meteor to pass through the watery part of the firmament, thus, in a perfectly timed way, bringing enough water to give the earth a proper baptism by immersion. That heavenly wave splashed around the earth so hard that much of the water bounced off and ended up on the moon, carrying away a second but much smaller ark, which, unfortunately, didn't have any non-human animals in it. When the moon finally dried out, it sustained a race of human lunarians who had their scriptures and traditions, but no priesthood authority. Philander establishes the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek among the people who convert to a restored gospel, a theme that happens repeatedly in the Book of Mormon. So, Lamech, son of the Lunarian king, becomes a banished prince, but leads the repentant Lunarians in righteousness, giving a speech that sounds very much like the oration that Amulek gives in the Book of Mormon. Notice how Spalding recycled aspects of this flood survivor myth from his Jaredite story, in which he made 8 much smaller arks in the form of these 8 invertible wooden would-be submarines. Also in the Romance of Celeste, Hauset the Hessian, a fictional son of the historical German prince Hesse-Kassel, gets banished and ends up living in the Allegheny Mountains. He eventually is converted to the cause of the Florentine heroes, becoming one himself, and then relates his backstory, which includes these words: "O thou prince of Hesse-Kassel, thou banished and outcast son of Christian parents, return, return." Close quote. Not surprisingly, Spalding invokes prince versus family drama in the Fabius story as well. He clearly loves the idea of making up banished princes that are tied to historically important families. But before closing out this point, let's go back and look more closely at Mr. Vogel's statement. Notice how he claims that I claimed, that Kircher claimed, that
his spindles worked by spiritual forces, electric forces, and magnetic forces, when actually they worked by hidden magnets, like a magician's stage illusion or parlor trick. Such talk was nothing but misdirection.
Pay close attention to how Mr. Vogel takes my underlined words somewhat out of context. Here is my full sentence. Quote, "In his doctoral thesis, Ars Magnesia, Kircher concluded that spiritual forces, electrical forces, and magnetic forces were three manifestations of the same phenomenon, for which he earned the title Sacre Theologiae Doctor, with the memorable postnominal STD. Close quote. My sentence didn't mention spindles at all. I did not claim that Kircher claimed that the spindles in some of his devices actually worked according to spiritual electromagnetism. Mr. Vogel took the subject of my sentence and made it the object of his sentence, inserting spindles as if it were my subject, and then pretended that I had claimed that Kircher had claimed something about the true way that those spindles worked. This is an apologetic tactic that should not be tolerated. My actual sentence was accurate and had no misdirection. Mr. Vogel taking it out of context and altering the subject for the purpose of implying that I misunderstood how Kircher understood his spindles to actually work is, most unfortunately, on Mr. Vogel's part.
Nothing but misdirection.
He goes on.
Joseph Smith was familiar with compasses, of course, but compasses worked independent of faith and righteousness.
That may be true, but such an observation doesn't support or weaken any authorship theory. In other words, it has no Bayesian value among the candidate authorship theories. None of Mr. Vogel's points impact the probability of Spalding choosing to incorporate into his writings any subset of the many elements of Kircher's balls of curious workmanship, hundreds of which were displayed in his Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities, and later in his world-famous Museo Kircheriano.
Some have seen possible sources of inspiration in the brass hand-warming balls of Joseph Smith's day, which contained hot coals.
Mr. Vogel does not tell us who some are, but he seems to have gotten this idea from this post-Mormon podcast, Mormonism Live, which featured this image as a potential inspiration for the Liahona. Mr. Vogel is a frequent guest on this podcast, a prolific contributor to the live chat, and a call-in listener quite often. Authentic brass hand warmers and brass bed warmers were indeed a thing in France and Victorian England, but they looked more like this. What Vogel calls a brass hand-warming ball is not a hand warmer at all, but a 19th century Chinese shadow ball, which has been clarified by the National Science and Media Museum in the UK, from which I quote. Understandably, these have occasionally been misidentified as hand warmers, but as they are made of metal, they'd become uncomfortable to handle pretty quickly. Rather, it is a 19th century Chinese shadow ball made of brass. It is in two parts and hinged across the center. You can see the clasp which holds it together. Inside is a gimbaled oil lamp with a small wick, which allows the flame to stay upright and cast shadows across the wall of a darkened room when the ball is rolled. Close quote. The clause, "You can see the clasp which holds it together," is not my addition, but part of the original. Understandably, sole authorship enthusiasts latch onto ideas like this in an attempt to say that anything in the Book of Mormon could have come from anything in Joseph Smith's milieu, and so consequently there is no need to entertain any evidence, textual or historical, that points to anyone else having composed any parts of the Book of Mormon. Such thinking is narrow and fallacious. Despite having looked reasonably thoroughly, I have yet to find any evidence that 19th century Chinese shadow balls, which were not even produced in China earlier than 1800, had somehow made it into rural New York by 1828. As pointed out by the aforementioned Science Museum, they would not have been hand warmers. They certainly didn't contain hot coals, which would produce far too high a temperature for the metallic orb to be handled, even with well-insulated cloths. Moreover, the hot ashes would necessarily fall right through, burning hands and leaving a mess. Not thinking it through is a hallmark of apologetic reasoning and sole authorship apologetic reasoning. But these Chinese shadow balls did contain mineral oil, so I'll go ahead and repeat Mr. Vogel's rather flaccid point.
And Lehi's brass ball was not filled with mineral oil.
Moreover, shadow balls don't have pointers or spindles. They don't get charged up with spiritual magnetism, they don't have writing on their sides, they don't work by faith, and they don't point the direction that one should go, all of which are common elements between Kircher's balls and Spalding's Liahona. Let's all try to remember that consistency is important when making arguments, and especially when publishing a review.
There was writing on Kircher's balls, to be sure, but that writing, such as numbers, letters, or astrological symbols, was permanent.
Here Mr. Vogel tries to argue that the Liahona mustn't have been influenced by Kircher's balls because the writing on the Liahona, in the fictitious story of course, was not permanent but fungible. Again, let's think this through. If Joseph Smith was able to imagine words appearing and disappearing onto a wordless hand warmer that wasn't a hand warmer, then surely Spalding, who is quite adept at writing epic and romantic fiction, was able to imagine words appearing and disappearing on Kircher's balls, which did actually have writing on them, regardless of whether the original depictions were exclusively alphabetic letters. Even more to the point, the message evoked by the spindles on Kircher's balls did change. The message was fungible. Mr. Vogel's insistence on these immaterial differences is yet another tired example of the composition division fallacy, this time with Mr. Vogel arguing that X could not have been influenced by Y as a whole because X doesn't contain each and every attribute of Y. But Spalding didn't have to, for example, work hidden bar magnets into his Mormon story to have been influenced by Kircher's many balls of curious workmanship. Let's all try to remember how valuable it can be to have colleagues or friends review such arguments before publishing them online. Mr. Vogel also attempts to put distance between Spalding's Liahona and Kircher's balls by likening the Liahona to
the spherical astrolabe used anciently to navigate the seas.
I can understand Mr. Vogel's desire to use the astrolabe as fallback inspiration for the Liahona. It was a navigation tool, after all, and was often made of brass. It also had measurement markings etched into its sides, but it had neither pointers nor spindles. It didn't work by faith, and the measurement markings were permanent, not fungible. But at least it didn't contain mineral oil. Even so, Spalding would have been more familiar with the astrolabe than Smith, and it would have meant more to Spalding, who was a true antiquarian and very well read. For what it's worth, Spalding did mention in the Romance of Celeste navigating with and without the points of compass and by the light of the pole star. Additionally, characters sometimes navigate by spiritual forces, aeolian harps, almost imperceptible music, mournful melodies, lamps filled with mineral oil, electric lamps, ethereal lamps, gentle breezes through the chasms of the earth, a literal paper trail, and threads from unraveled stockings. That said, I do agree with Mr. Vogel that Joseph Smith might have, at some point, likened the pointers or spindles inside the Liahona to miniature divining rods, which Father Smith, as we know, had employed in search of buried treasure. It is no stretch at all to see how some details from Spalding's text might have resonated with Smith, given his folk magic conditioning, and maybe even persuaded him, along with Rigdon's testimony, that the text before him was genuinely what it claimed for itself to be, an abridgment of ancient records, as Spalding had intended. Because Mr. Vogel frames every discussion of any Spalding-Rigdon-Smith subtheory as a villainous conspiracy, he is unable to imagine a more parsimonious explanation, with Rigdon and Smith believing that they had been chosen and prepared to bring forth something that they mistook for ancient scripture.
But there is no compelling reason to conclude Lehi's Liahona had anything to do with Kircher's glass balls.
I think that most viewers by now will agree that there is no compelling reason to conclude that Vogel's faux hand warmers had anything to do with Spaulding's brass ball. The parallels between Kircher's balls and Lehi's ball are compelling, and as that tenured professor said, demand an explanation. In contrast, Mr. Vogel has done his best to make the case that Joseph Smith might have invented the Liahona after having been inspired by parallels that are clearly inferior on every point of inspection. So now let us turn our attention to the word Mormon. Arguably, this is the most important name in the Book of Mormon. One would think that this name might have some significance to whoever wrote the story. Before discussing the potential etymologies that I put forward in my book, let's look at the top 3 explanations that Vogel submits for our consideration. 1. Smith was exposed to the surnames Morman, M-O-R-M-A-N, or Mormon, M-O-R-M-O-N, their rarity notwithstanding, and just went with it because why not? 2. Mormon, like Nephi, is just a weird coincidence, with Smith not having any reason for choosing the name. 3. Mormon is the softening of Morgan.
There are, for example, 0.91 people with the name Mormon, M-O-R-M-A-N, for every 100,000 Americans. And there are 0.11 people with the last name Mormon for every 100,000 Americans.
Smith, at 22, didn't know anywhere close to 100,000 Americans, so the chances that he knew even one person named Mormon, of whatever spelling, is extremely low. But even if he had pulled such a name out of the 19th century equivalent of a phone book, why would such a name hold such significance for Smith to make it the name of his titular character, who is supposedly a prophet historian, a pseudepigraphist, and a reformed Egyptian linguist? To be sure, not every character in someone's fiction is going to have a clever rationale for his name, but the main and standout characters usually do.
Nielsen balks at the suggestion that the names Nephi and Mormon are coincidences. But coincidences happen more often than people realize. The law of truly large numbers says that with a large enough sample, many odd coincidences are likely to happen.
First, I wouldn't use the word box. I considered it carefully, and I patiently studied various versions of the Smith sole-authorship theory, including Mr. Vogel's, and had 2 feet firmly in that camp for a good 5 years after resigning from the Mormon Church in 2010. During those years, I, like many post-Mormons, just accepted that Smith, being a con man, might have blurted out 591 pages of epic fiction in 60 working days. But researching the matter carefully, I personally found many of Mr. Vogel's arguments to be dissatisfying, illogical, and even inconsistent. Second, these numbers are not truly large. They are medium-sized, at most medium-large, which is nothing like the truly large numbers that statistically the law of truly large numbers is talking about. We're not discussing 2 children in the same classroom having the same very common first name. Nephi and Mormon are very rare and obscure, but are tied together through Jesuits of the same decade who were famous and disgraced for making up their sources and for faking translations of ancient texts. Third, I did seriously discuss, without balking, the possibility of random co-occurrence quite circumspectly in my book. Quote, "It is of course possible that the Kircherisms are coincidental, though that is extremely improbable given their specificity and context. Nephi and Mormon are extremely rare proper nouns, and both allude to fictitious sources fabricated by Jesuits in the 1630s." Close quote. Fourth, and quite alarmingly, Mr. Vogel decided not to mention in his takedown videos that it was Thomas Boyes, not me, who was the first to publish in 1858 his hypothesis that the name Mormon in the Book of Mormon was an intentional reference to
La Parasite Moment Histoire Comique, or Mormon the Parasite, a Comic History,
which was the infamous caricature of French Jesuit and professor of Oriental languages Pierre de Monmort. After acknowledging the possibility of coincidence, Boyes says, quote, "There are, however, grounds for an opinion that, in tracing to its source the name of Mormon, we have come upon the origin or first idea to which may be attributed not the name only, but also the Book of Mormon." Close quote. At the end of the article, he says, quote, "There seems good reason for suspecting whoever was the author of the Book of Mormon, that in his first conceptions of the work, he borrowed a hint from that tissue of fictions and forgeries which at Paris in the middle of the 17th century enveloped the unfortunate Pierre de Monmort." Close quote. Boyes acknowledges in his article that the evidence attributing the Book of Mormon to Solomon Spaulding had not been sufficient to settle the authorship question historically, but, quote, "the book bears internal evidence of having been originally written by a Jew, though since enlarged and modified to answer the purposes of proselytism." Close quote. Despite the distance, Boyes was obviously aware that the leading explanation for the origin of the Book of Mormon involves Solomon Spaulding. As a linguist himself, Boyes concluded that the Book of Mormon exhibited enough internal linguistic consistency to suspect that its true author was familiar with Hebraisms and might have even been a Jew. Spaulding fits this bill, having studied Hebrew at Dartmouth College under Professor John Smith. Monmort and Kircher were both members of the Republic of Letters. In honor of that republic, Professor John Smith would often deliver his lectures as if they were letters to that republic of students. Spaulding mentions the Republic of Letters specifically multiple times in The Romance of Celeste. Boyes gives another reason for suggesting that the use of the name Mormon might be more than just coincidence. He notes that the term Montmorisme in French, quote, "became at Paris the common name for a pun." Close quote. Monmort was viciously pilloried for constructing, quote, "obscure ancient literary forms and spending whole days toying with onomastics and anagrams." Close quote. So, according to the French historian Salingras, the burlesquers of Monmort made an ironic anagram out of his own name. Thus, the nickname Mormon was born. As we shall see, Spaulding played with the word Mormon anagrammatically and ironically as well.
Apparently, Lavoisier created the name Mormon by transposing the syllables in Monmort's name. Monmort was mocked as a literary parasite because he freely plagiarized ancient writers and got caught fabricating sources.
Mr. Vogel is technically incorrect again because Monmort didn't plagiarize ancient writers. He didn't take someone else's work and present it as his own. Rather, he composed pseudepigrapha in their name and then made up other seemingly related sources. Monmort, unlike Kircher, however, did produce authentic-looking documents that were, by definition, forgeries. But like Kircher, he used his knowledge of ancient languages to make his pseudepigraphic texts seem historical. This is precisely what Spaulding set out to do with his epic fiction, so picking the name Mormon, just like picking the name Nephi, was quite clever. Mr. Vogel also contends that Smith would not have been influenced by anything happening in high society France from the prior 2 centuries, and so could not have been influenced by the infamy of Monmort or the Tale of Mormon. On that point, Mr. Vogel is absolutely correct. Smith could not have known anything about this without a focused college education. Spaulding, however, could have and did. How do we know? Again, just read The Romance of Celeste. It is clear that Spalding had studied the history and the literature of the prior 2 centuries quite deeply. He quotes leaders and writers throughout this time period, including among the French. He even permutes their historical names as he creates characters, including Florentine heroes. He gives us Chevalier de Médary, Mademoiselle la Comte, Monsieur Montgarry, and Monsieur de Staël. That last one is probably the most important on this topic. De Staël is a 1-letter permutation of the surname of arguably the most interesting and influential female of the Enlightenment, Madame de Staël, the quintessential woman of letters. She was present at the Estates General of 1789 and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It was her championing of Romanticism as a literary movement that contributed significantly to its widespread recognition. As the daughter of the Director General of Finance under King Louis XVI, she was close to all of the most consequential minds and writers of France, hosting from time to time some of the country's most coveted salons. In America, she was admired by the wives of the Founding Fathers, including Abigail Adams and her daughter-in-law Louisa Catherine Adams, for her radical feminist views and highly publicized books. She was also an outspoken revolutionary against Napoleon, writing speeches for men to publicly deliver in an attempt to diminish the emperor's insatiable conquest for power. Napoleon exiled her and publicly burned over 10,000 copies of Jane Grey, an essay that de Staël had published, in which she compared her destiny as both a casualty of political suicide and a sacrifice in opposition to tyranny to the fate of Lady Jane Grey of England, who was beheaded after reigning only 9 days because of a coup d'etat. But how do we know that Spalding's Monsieur de Staël is a direct allusion to Madame de Staël? There is a change of gender and a 1-letter vowel shift in the surname, after all. Again, truly understanding all that Spalding knew, read, and wrote is critical. When Philander and Josephine get to Jupiter, the character de Staël takes them on a tour of the planet where they meet some of the victims of history's worst secret combinations, witnessing now their glory and triumph of their having stood firm and true even in the face of imminent death. One such exalted being was Lady Jane Grey. "Look up," said de Staël, "and behold the glory of the anointed of the Lord, whom he hath pleased to exalt." We looked up and saw 12 shining dignitaries with unparalleled beauty and grace, and crowned with the laurels of martyrdom, the principal of whom was Lady Jane Grey. These were attended by 144 cherubim who were shining, singing, and harping as they passed in review 3 times around the outer court of the temple. The appearance of Lady Jane in every respect was calculated to inspire one's mind with the most exalted views of human character, which was originally designed to elevate the standard of human greatness and place mankind above the influence of temptation. She was of that dignified, serene model of intellect and that spiritual sublimity that excites the envy and jealousy of baser beings and brings down the vengeance of the assassin. Unfortunate upon the earth she was, but princess ethereal she is. Her robe was of the most perfect whiteness, and ornamented upon its borders with treble rows of orange blossoms just beginning to expand. Her head was crowned with a white diadem, wreathed with laurel, and having 6 spires tipped with carbuncle, so as to resemble brilliant drops of blood just ready to fall. When we came to the front of the temple, a door was opened through the pavement. With our chariots being in readiness, we took our departure for the upper surface of Jupiter." Close quote. Spalding doesn't give names to his characters willy-nilly. He doesn't pull them randomly out of a phone book. None of them seem to be coincidences. He puts tremendous thought into them and weaves associated details that only the most educated could know into the plot. He did it with Monsieur de Staël, he did it with Monsieur Montgarry, and he did it with Monsieur Momont.
The relationship, no matter how tempting is spurious. There is no reason to link Kircher's Nephi and Voyer's Mormon, and one doesn't strengthen the other or make their appearance in the Book of Mormon more plausible.
At this point, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. The nickname Mormon was a well-known word, as was Nephi, among linguists, but virtually no one else. Neither name was in the general milieu, especially not in 1828 Palmyra. These two names serve to be cautionary tales for future professors of Oriental languages who might be tempted to make up their sources. As a student himself of a professor of Oriental languages, Spalding knew that and capitalized on it, choosing two names, each associated with an infamous professor of Oriental languages, each of whom was made famous by lost manuscripts that they claimed to have found, was a chef's kiss of ingenuity when writing his own manuscripts found.
Anyone familiar with La Parasite Mormon would not have used the name as the main character in a pseudepigraphic creation.
I'm not sure why Mr. Vogel just throws out these kinds of assertions as if they were self-evident, when quite obviously they fail on the simplest of tests. How wrong would it be to say anyone familiar with Shakespeare's villainous Iago would not put the name to a secretly conspiring member of a sultan's court? No, absolutely not. To any of Mr. Vogel's subscribers who just sheepishly accept such claims, stop this video and start checking out some books. Literature is full of characters, major and minor, heroes and villains, that allude to other characters by copying, inverting, or permuting the names of the prior protagonists and antagonists. Mr. Vogel's statement is an assertion, not an argument, and it certainly doesn't stand on its own.
Without anything to prop it up, the name Mormon appearing in 17th century France is no more authoritative than other possible sources Joseph Smith had available to him. In fact, any 19th century American source is far more likely than Bayer's Mormon.
First of all, Vallées Mormon isn't a source for the Book of Mormon under any authorship theory. It is an influence. Sources and influences are different things. Second, there are several supports propping up the idea that the character Mormon was inspired by the caricature Mormon, including Thomas Boyes' conclusion, which again Mr. Vogel concealed from his viewers. Third, Spalding was very well educated on the history and literature of all aspects of the Enlightenment, including the roles played by influential French authors, not the least of which was Madame de Staël, born in the 1700s, so much so that he would give her name to Monsieur de Staël and even make him the most intelligent of all the Florentine heroes. Quote, "But our Monsieur de Staël, for so he called himself, and so we must call him, was one of the most perfect models of craniological greatness that we ever beheld. He not only took off his hat, but he pulled a silken glove from his right hand, and a most genteel hand it was," etc., etc. You see, when the Florentines pass their first Florentine mission, they give themselves a new name that they shall be known by henceforth on all future missions. It is very understandable and a very human response for Mr. Vogel to so quickly and summarily dismiss Kircher's Nephi and Monmore's Mormon without rereading the Romance of Celeste, which I urged him publicly to do before attacking my theory. I also urged him to try to understand what Spalding knew, what he read, and what inspired him to write. But here's the deal. Before my book, no present-day Mormon historian, and no non-Mormon Mormon historian ever knew that the names Nephi and Mormon even existed as bona fide person names associated with fake ancient texts. When presented with this new information, Mr. Vogel could have pushed his own pause button long enough to study my footnotes for understanding, or to read up on the recent scholarship on Kircher and his Nephi, or to peruse Thomas Boy's article. Let's all be a little slower in the future before knee-jerkingly opposing new ideas. By all means, stress test them, yes, for that is how they rise or fall, but do so first in good faith collaboration, and make sure that when it comes time to publicly oppose something against which you might have a bias, that you have educated yourself out of your ignorance before publicly condemning something that you don't actually understand. That said, let's explore this 19th century American source that Vogel says is far more likely to have served as the inspiration for Mormon than Mormon.
Some in the 19th century suggested that it was a play on anti-Masonic martyr William Morgan's last name, which ties in with the Book of Mormon's warning against Latter-day Secret combinations.
Vogel's chief source here for the speculative softening of Morgan into Mormon is the article Psychological Tests for the Authorship of the Book of Mormon, which was written by Walter F. Prince in 1917. There, Prince runs with the speculations of Pomeroy Tucker and Thomas Gregg that maybe Smith's purpose in composing pseudo-history was to use fiction to promote anti-Masonic views and repudiate secret societies without saying so explicitly. They were correct that someone was doing just that in writing what ultimately became the Book of Mormon. They were just wrong in saying that the author was Smith. In his article, Prince asserts that the admonition within the Book of Mormon to fight against the secret combinations of the Gadianton robbers came directly from George Washington's farewell address, in which he said, quote, "Combinations are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government." Close quote. I tend to agree with Prince on this point. The single greatest antagonizing force in the Romance of Celeste is a secret band of cavern-hiding robbers who, throughout the novel and in all ages, are thwarted by Florentine heroes, one of whom was General Washington. These mountain robbers have chiefs and kings, hide in dens and caves, attack settlements as gangs, and are sometimes called bandits or the banditti. This network of caves is vast and even intercontinental, resulting from an interesting mythology. At some point in Earth's past, it got hit just right by a meteor which cracked the crust of the Earth so as to produce deep cave systems in all the mountain ranges of the world. Quote, "In some ancient and unrecorded era of time, the Earth received a tremendous concussion which rent her rocks and produced in many places great fissures or openings that extend through a length of miles, some of which are open to the surface of the earth and even to the tops of mountains, while others are shut in like subterranean territories and make convenient temples for the display of light and truth." Close quote. Long story made short, the good guys, who are ancient pre-flood masons, build structures of stone throughout the caves, the deepest levels of which become temples that are protected by enchantments and powered by spiritual electromagnetism. The bad guys, unfortunately, end up infiltrating the top caves, always hiding out from law enforcement and stashing their jewels and precious metals, which they use to fund their works of darkness when not robbing and plundering from the land round about. And so Spalding has a poignant setting for his conflicts and metaphors. There's the struggle for enlightenment in places of darkness. There's the striving for holiness despite the nearness of evil. And there's the sacred society of the Florentines contrasted against the secret combinations of the robbers. The following 6 slides are by no means all the relevant references on this topic, but they provide a good sense for just how seriously Spalding held his anti-Masonic views, which he happened to put into all of his fiction, including the Fabius story, the Mormon story, and the Romance of Celeste. There have been robbers in every age, from Adam down to the present. All but Noah's family had joined the proud banditti before a huge and shapeless mass from chaos came and hurled himself amidst watery worlds, and on his shapeless nucleus he bore a mighty flood. But the Prince of Darkness had given the reins of the government to the banditti. I should have shuddered to think that probably I was near a den of robbers. In one of the temples, the New Florentines find abridged records from earlier Florentines. Then Florence, which is a title given to the angelic leader of the current Florentines, quote, gave the reading of the ancient roll, the history of the bandits' grand defeat. Formerly, England was nearly overrun with robbers who infested every town and village in the countryside. Their retreat was so securely invisible and mysterious as to overawe the inhabitants and oblige them to enclose with walls, or garrison, every town. This induced their king at last to offer great rewards to anyone who would discover their strongholds. No one came forward with the desired intelligence, for all dreaded the robbers, and none felt safe to expose any circumstance against them. Let's compare those sentences to these excerpts from the Book of Mormon. Because of the exceeding greatness of the numbers of those robbers who infested the mountains. The Gadianton robbers, who dwelt in the mountains, who did infest the land, were so strong in their holds and their secret places that the people could not overpower them. And finally, that they might by some means flatter them out of their strongholds. The intrusion of the banditti brought on their own destruction and overthrow, just as almost every trial of the kind has ever done before. They felt so secure, and at the same time so avaricious and bloodthirsty, that they could not delay bloodshed any longer. Quote, for I belong to a little faithful band whose whole business is to pluck unfortunate worth and merit from the blighting grasp of the sons of perdition. I mean the banditti, who have enlisted the powers of hell on their side with the full intention of overthrowing all moral, civil, religious, and political fabrics in the universe. Close quote. Let's compare those excerpts to the Gadianton robbers, who did prove the overthrow, yea, almost the entire destruction of the people of Nephi. Destruction and overthrow appear together in other verses as well. For example, to our overthrow and utter destruction, and the sword of justice of the eternal God shall fall upon you, to your overthrow and destruction. He was the first to unite a nation of robbers under one chief and give them laws and religion, receiving all his followers into a paradise of his own fancy. The axe had fallen, and with it fell the robbers' chief, but soon another prince was crowned. And thus we learn that when the bantering swain had challenged 2 proud kings, he sought their own stronghold, for they were both the bandits' kings, who then by fraud and blood and usurpation obtained at once the wealth and honor of the nation. But now the stripling youth disguised himself and lodged and ate within the bandits' lines. Compare this to the young servant of Helaman, who infiltrated the band of robbers and eventually slays Kishkumen. And here are 2 more quotes from the Romance of Celeste. The bloody instrument of a gang of robbers, and we called this the old bandit's cavern, from its possessing so many evidences of its having been the retreat of a vast number of warlike men. Here are some more. The vigilance of the banditti exceeds all human ingenuity, and were you to watch their maneuvers for 10 years, you would scarcely know where to suspect an accomplice or track out their hiding places. Compare that to the characterization in Helaman 11, and then they would retreat back into the mountains and into the wilderness and secret places, hiding themselves in the footsteps of this hellish clan, and crying from the ground for vengeance, justice, mercy, and deliverance from these dire scourges of the human race. Mormon says that the people's blood will Cry unto the Lord from the ground for vengeance. In Ether 8, Moroni, Mormon's son, says that any nation that should uphold such secret oaths and combinations shall be destroyed, for the Lord will not suffer that the blood of the saints shall always, quote, cry unto him from the ground for vengeance. We found ourselves within a long and narrow hall, which proved to be the bottom of the chasm that had so long concealed the victims of the murderous banditti. Our eyes, too fearful to relate, beheld in sad surprise the bandits' olden catacomb, a fearful sight. Bones heaped upon bones promiscuous lay, untouched and uninterred, told tales of centuries passed away. Is it also just a coincidence that heaps of bones show up in Spalding's Mormon story, untouched and uninterred for centuries, and their bones have been found and have been heaped up? Nevertheless, they did find a land which had been peopled, yea, a land which was covered with dry bones. Here's an especially intriguing quote about secret combinations infiltrating the Catholic Church. And as to the vain pomp of the Catholics, it is just what all societies, whether Protestant, Christian, pagan, Mohammedan, or whatever, are aiming at through the wily craftiness of Lucifer. A splendid religion, decorated in silver slippers and robed in the most costly and shining earthly materials, is often too dazzling an illusion not to overthrow the best intentions, and is, after all our teachings and admonitions, the grand bait of the enemy to decoy us into the ranks of the banditti. Compare that to the strong anti-Catholic rhetoric in the Book of Mormon, and notice how Spalding recycles the pride cycle in the Romance of Celeste from his prior Mormon story. Behold the gold and the silver and the silks and the scarlets and the fine twined linen and the precious clothing and the harlots are the desires of this great and abominable church. And also for the praise of the world do they destroy the saints of God and bring them down into captivity. Mormon leaders today try to suggest that the very anti-Catholic passages in the Book of Mormon were just anti-evil and not specifically anti-Catholic, but that was not Spalding's intent. Just read his words. They are clear. There are many more references to these bands of robbers who keep springing up after getting defeated by righteous heroes, but the foregoing slides should be more than enough to make the point that Spalding was very anti-secret combination, very anti-Catholic, and very anti-Masonic. Spalding even refers to one of the caves as a lodge. Quote, the member from Kentucky arose again, this I learned afterwards, and delivered an embassage from the southern banditti, who had determined to locate a permanent lodge in the Great Kentucky Cave. For, as it was stated in the embassage, all they ask is the assistance of numbers and strength to cooperate with them in dispossessing the present occupants and establishing regular lines from the cave to other parts of the United States. Close quote. Spalding featured this band of robbers in his Fabius story as well, who were, again, quote, the most ferocious band of murderers that ever disgraced humanity, close quote. As far as I can tell, there is no evidence that Smith or anyone in his nuclear family was, in any way, anti-secret combination, anti-Catholic, anti-Masonic, or anti-cave, for that matter. Many accounts portray the Smiths, Father Smith especially, but also Joseph Smith, as spending considerable time lounging around in caves looking for secret treasure. Did young Joseph Smith, desperate to keep his parents' marriage together, string together over 250,000 words as a loving way to send a secret message to his dad that he should stop hanging out in caves with Luman Walters, Samuel Lawrence, and Alva Beeman? Mr. Vogel argues that this is the case. For him, everything in the Book of Mormon is an autobiographical reflection of Smith's own life. But unfortunately, having made the assumption of Smith's sole authorship, he reads things into the text that are not there. Even John Hamer, who is also a sole authorship theorist, but much kinder and more well respected in the community, texted this to me regarding Mr. Vogel's work, Quote, Vogel goes nuts with this explanatory stuff in his book, way over the top, and I think that really confuses the case, as if every little thing in the Book of Mormon is in Joseph Smith's life at the moment. So, by way of overplaying the case, he actually undercuts his credibility. Close quote. On this point, I tend to agree with Mr. Hamer. Nevertheless, Mr. Vogel continues to assert that Joseph Smith is responsible for
the Book of Mormon's preoccupation with secret combinations, destroying both the Nephite and Jaredite nations.
No. The preoccupation with secret combinations in the Book of Mormon evidently comes from the mind of Solomon Spaulding, not from the mind of Joseph Smith. And so is
its warning of latter-day secret combinations about to destroy America.
The Book of Mormon is clearly anti-Masonic. Yes, we all agree on that. But the Smith family was not anti-Masonry at all. On the contrary, they were pro-Masonry. Some historians still argue about whether Father Smith had been initiated in the Ontario Lodge, and it does seem that Hiram Smith had indeed become a Mason before 1828. Joseph, however, was too young to join the Freemasons before 1828, but later in life, in 1842 to be precise, he found a way of co-opting the Masonic rituals for his own benefit. By appropriating the rites and passages of Freemasonry into the Mormon endowment, he usurped a model of fraternal hierarchy and social control to help him maintain his priesthood hierarchy and dogmatic control. The idea, however, that 22-year-old Joseph Smith, right after being exposed to William Morgan's 1826 disappearance and presumed murder for publishing an anti-Masonic book, courageously decided to up and publish a 591-page epic novel dripping with anti-Masonic rhetoric, all the while intentionally, transparently, and audaciously alluding to Morgan by softening it to Mormon, is patently ridiculous. The Smiths were not socially conscious crusaders for equality and social justice. Smith was not a brilliant, well-read author seeking to inspire change in his community through the lens of literature. Spaulding, however, was. The Smiths, in contrast, were the lowlifes of canal town society. Idle, indolent, money-digging, gingerbread peddling, brothel-going, glass-looking vagabonds. In 1826, Smith himself was hauled into court for juggling, vagrancy, and for being a disorderly person and an impostor. And that was just the first time. History would repeat itself 41 more times, and not on trumped-up charges, before Smith would die in a shootout. As I say in the book, his death was no martyrdom, but a coup, the result of a secret combination of his own making. Smith didn't rail against secret combinations and blood oaths in the Book of Mormon, firstly, because he didn't compose it, and secondly, in contrast, because he embraced such things in his personal life from a very early age with his group of money diggers, and then with his secret wives and concubines, with his temple penalties, with his law of consecration, and with his own mafia. Think of Orrin Porter Rockwell, Joseph H. Jackson, and the Danites. Chances are high that Smith didn't even conceive that the secret combinations in the manuscript he didn't compose were actually anti-Masonic. He wasn't well-read or book-smart. He was opportunistic and street-smart, and that's about it. He probably barely understood what he was reading as he hastily and performatively dictated to his scribes in the spring of 1829 that which, I believe, he had previously obtained from Rigdon. For Smith, the first purpose of the manuscript was to get quick money, if he could, even if that meant having his lackey of a second cousin, Oliver Cowdery, attempt to pawn off the copyrights somewhere in Canada. Quote, I, God, grant unto my servant, Joseph Smith, a privilege that he may sell a copyright through you, Oliver Cowdery. Close quote. Smith didn't put careful thought into it because it wasn't his baby. He would have been happy to abandon it for money. The Nephi Mormon story, however, was the brainchild of Solomon Spaulding. Also, for what it's worth, G doesn't soften to M. In Romance languages, G can soften into a Y. In Middle English, it sometimes glides into a W. In Modern English, it can go silent or get dropped when paired with an N. When G hardens, it usually devoices into a K or a hard C sound, but it never softens to M. Certainly Spaulding would not have made such a rookie mistake. Of course, Smith, being a phonetically uneducated 22-year-old, conceivably could have made such a linguistic blunder, but he didn't. Mormon was Spaulding's invention. Mr. Vogel's argument that Smith deliberately put Mormon into the Book of Mormon as a clever clue to Morgan, while arguing that no one could have put Nephi or Mormon into the Book of Mormon as clever clues to Nephi and Mormon, sounds a lot like special pleading. He then tries to argue that variations of words containing the Morse syllable in the Book of Mormon are further evidence that Smith himself created the permutations.
Prince included a chart showing the 25 permutations of the name Mormon. Mormon isn't just the name of the editor of the Book of Mormon, but it appears as the name of a Lamanite king, his son, a forest, a land, and a body of water.
Technically, on this list, which has a spelling error, there are only 7 permutations, not 25 permutations, whatever those are. With or without a mutation within permutation, this list is not evidence that Smith creatively played with prefixes, roots, and suffixes. Nor is it evidence that Smith sometimes mixed person names and place names to suit his literary goals. But it is evidence that someone did just that. As we have seen already, Spaulding intentionally and charmingly mixed person and place names, especially with rivers, saying specifically that doing so was, quote, evidence of the author's impartiality and veracity. He also creatively played with prefixes, roots, and suffixes in both his Fabius story and in the Romance of Celeste. And not just a little bit, but in highly intricate ways that very closely resemble the method he employed in the manuscript that eventually became the Book of Mormon. On the left side of this slide are names from the Fabius story. On the right-hand side are names from the Mormon story. The largest cluster of names in the Book of Mormon starts with Am. Similarly, the largest cluster of names in the Fabius story starts with the Hebrew root Ham, which brings to mind the morphing of Abram to Abraham, as well as the skin-darkening biblical curse of Ham, as it was believed in Spaulding's day. In my book, I discussed how Spaulding may have employed H-dropping, or H-adding, depending on how you look at it, intentionally, as it was a controversial linguistic topic in his day. Spaulding evolves his names with consistency on both sides of the line. On the right, Am gets connected to Lamb, Ram, and Sam. On the left, Ham also connects to Lamb, Ram, and Sam. Lamb goes to Lem, and Ham goes to Hem. He adds suffixes. Laban goes to Laban Co. Incidentally, the sword of Laban and the sword of Laban Co. are major plot elements in both stories. On both sides, we've got names with C changing to K and CH changing to K or to CK. Name fragments are often compounded with others. Here at the top, Laman and Enoch make Lamech with a CH. Incidentally, Spaulding probably wanted Laman to be pronounced Laman, but we don't have to go into that here. Lamech drifts into 3 closely related versions, Lamech, Lamech, and Lamach. Not surprisingly, Laban Co. and Lamech fuse into Labamac, which forms a group with Labasca, Lobasca, and Basca. Similarly, Ammon and Moron fuse into Amaron, which has its own permutations. For example, Amaron with an A and Amaron with only one M, which forms a group with Ammonite, Ammonihah, and Ammoniahite. On the left, Ham goes to Gam, and on the right, Am goes to Gad. Gad forms its own cluster, and then, perhaps with the biblical Gilead coming to mind, he generates a Gid cluster. As if such fecundity were not enough, the two come together to make a cute little baby Giga cluster. One can easily see Spalding thinking about featuring Gilgal and Gilgash as a deliberate hat tip to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Contrast the right side triad, Gadianton, Corianton, and Morianton, with Hambach, Kelsok, and Rambach. Notice how Spalding intentionally pulls names from the Bible into his clusters. For example, Enoch, Laban, Ammon, Rama, Sam, Gideon, and Nimrod. But now notice how Nimrod conspicuously maps to Moonrod and Lacunrod on the Fabius story side of the line. By the way, Lacunrod is a high priest who chastises Elsion for allowing, quote, the priesthood to have too much influence in the court of Rambach, close quote. Speaking of Elsion, there is a plethora of ons going on both sides. On the left, we have Nemapon, Ohan, Elsion, Helion, Helicon, and Lamon with a silent B. On the right, we have Ammon, Amulon, Amaron, Moron, Mormon, Morianton, Corianton, Gadianton, and Gideon. Such suffixes work for Spalding because they are Semitic, Roman, and biblical. Think of Sidon and Zion, for example. Notice how Greek and or Roman names appear on both sides, which are totally anachronistic in the Mormon story. Spalding does this intentionally, signaling to the discerning reader that these epic stories from lost manuscripts found are designed to be something of an American Aeneid, which in its own day served to entertain and unify the diverse peoples of the Italian peninsula through a fictional, epic, and even Homeric tale of all time. The best two sole authorship arguments for this observation are, 1, that Smith deliberately put these Greco-Roman names, Laconius, Archeantus, and Antipas, in the Book of Mormon because he believed that his epic visions were true, or 2, that Smith did so because it amused himself to con his future supporters in this way. A much better explanation is that Spalding loved all of the Greek and Roman mythology that he fully consumed at Plainfield Academy, at Dartmouth College, at the Cherry Valley Academy, and elsewhere. Consequently, he didn't mind dropping in anachronistic names, anachronistic animals, and anachronistic metallurgy. In the Romance of Celeste, Spalding's Florentine heroes repeatedly recount to one another great battle scenes from different ages and continents, all with very revisionist and even anachronistic details, which are sometimes displayed on that subterranean IMAX theater, and at other times, literally, on the electromagnetic clouds that surround their electric cars so as to entertain themselves and more quickly pass the time on their way to Jupiter. Yes, Spalding was the first to invent in-flight movies, long before Edgar Allan Poe, Jules Verne, or H.G. Wells, who are often mentioned as the founders of science fiction. Solomon Spalding was writing his own highly imaginative science fiction on the American frontier. But this slide notwithstanding, Mr. Vogel doesn't see any consistent naming patterns at all between the Fabius story and the Mormon story. Speaking of me, Mr. Vogel says,
He spends pages playing with names in the Book of Mormon and Spalding's writings, manipulating the syllables and dropping letters, attempting to show a relationship, but I found this utterly unconvincing.
It is very improper of Mr. Vogel to reduce my chapter on Spalding's consistent and creative naming conventions to this one intentionally poorly constructed diagram. This one figure alone should be enough to cause all of Mr. Vogel's subscribers to seriously reevaluate their relationship with him. No true scholars represent someone else's work this way. But let's go back to Walter Prince's article and examine the relationships that Mr. Vogel does find compelling and see how consistent he is. Prince says that Amaron might have come from William Morgon. Probably not. It more likely came from a fusion of ammon and moron, with moron coming from the prefix more and one of Spalding's favorite suffixes, on. Ammon, of course, comes directly from the Bible. And where did more come from, you might ask, since it probably didn't come from the Bible, unless you want to argue that it was influenced by Mordecai. Of course, it could have been the case that Spalding just picked a syllable, maybe from a phone book, and just went with it. But he didn't. We know where he got more through studying the Romance of Celeste. Again, Spalding didn't have to recycle ideas that he had put into his manuscripts found, including the Mormon story, but he did, and we're so lucky to have it. For now, just remember that in the Book of Mormon, quote, "The land of Moron is where the king dwelt." Prince says that both Mathoni and Mathonaha are disguised ways of saying Masonic, if you add a C at the end and apply TH fronting to the middle of the word. Again, probably not. It is better explained by truncating Matthew, a Hebrew name from the Bible, and then putting on Spalding's favorite endings, on, I, and even ha. On is a common multifunctional suffix in Hebrew. I is also common and signifies possession or association. Ha is reminiscent of the feminine marker ah, but here with more H adding, which again was a controversial linguistic topic in Spalding's day. American colonists tended to add back the consonant H to words where it had been dropped in Britain, so this was just all a bit of fun for Spalding. And so is this short clip.
In Hartford, Hereford, and Hampshire, hurricanes hardly ever happen. Now, repeat that after me. In Hartford, Hereford, and Hampshire, hurricanes hardly ever happen.
In Hartford, Hereford, and Hampshire, hurricanes hardly ever happen.
Oh, no. No here at all.
As we have seen, Spalding used H adding throughout manuscripts found while playing promiscuously with such suffixes. Smith, in contrast, had not a jot of Hebrew nor a tittle of general linguistic education at 22. Furthermore, Mathoni and Mathoniha are two of the 12 Nephite disciples, implying that consistent Jesus would have chosen 12 apostles in America as well. This context is highly suggestive of Matt being influenced by the Gospel of Matthew. But even if we were to admit Prince's speculation that Mathonic is also a play on the word Masonic, think of Sirius Black, it is still more likely that Spalding would do that than Smith. Prince speculates that all the names with anti or ant in them are meant to reinforce an anti-Masonic sentiment. Perhaps. But again, Spalding is more likely to do something like that than Smith. He argues that Helaman is an anagram of Emma Hale if you take away an E and an M and then add an N. Mr. Vogel, by now, I hope, has found this to be
utterly unconvincing.
Again, no. It looks like Spalding simply added the Hebrew ha as a prefix to Laman, thereby suggesting some holiness of character, thus changing a bad guy into a good guy. Prince speculates that all these names, starting with the core sound, probably came from Smith loving a girl named Cora before he met Emma, or hating a boy named Corey. Maybe Spalding had something like that in mind, but probably not. Spalding wasn't petty like that. Last one, I promise. Prince says that Zeezrom probably came from Chesebro, since Chesebro was the name of one of the men arrested for Morgan's abduction. Walter Prince is obviously not a linguist and doesn't think like one, or like a writer or a detective for that matter. I think we can all agree that Prince's analysis is pretty bad, and any attempt to hold it up in defense of Smith's sole authorship apologetics is, in my opinion, pretty cheesy, bro. In short, every name-based argument that Prince and Vogel use as textual evidence for Smith sole authorship is better suited to Spalding each and every time. But rather than getting our ox stuck in Prince's mire, let's look for name pattern relationships from other authors and see whether we can produce a name pattern map as tight, as vast, and as consistent as this one. Mine everything. Use AI if you want, and see what you can come up with. Any luck with Charles Dickens? What about Samuel Clemens? I know, Shakespeare. Not even Homer or Virgil, whom Spalding was clearly trying to emulate, have naming clusters that are so tight, so vast, and so consistent. The only one that starts to come close is James Macpherson, a name that I dropped 5 times earlier in this presentation. Who is James Macpherson? He's an infamous Scottish writer who composed a vast work of epic poems in 2 volumes that he claimed to have discovered and translated from ancient Gaelic sources, when in reality he made up the whole thing. It was first published in 1761, the year that Spalding was born, and was quite famous in Europe and among the literati of the United States for about 50 years. The stories center around Fingal, the hero, as narrated by Ossian, whose name Macpherson derived by manipulating syllables and dropping letters from Oisin, who is generally regarded as the most legendary poet and bard in all of Ireland. Some regarded this new Ossian, whom again Macpherson had invented, to be the Celtic equivalent of Homer. Even Thomas Jefferson said in 1773, "I am not ashamed to own that I think this rude bard of the North the greatest poet that has ever existed." In contrast, at about the time that Spalding was attending Dartmouth, Samuel Johnson famously repudiated Macpherson, calling him a mountebank, a liar, and a fraud. Using textual evidences, Johnson concluded that Macpherson's 2 books, Fingal and Timora, together constituted as gross an imposition as ever the world was troubled with. We can find much evidence in the Romance of Celeste that Spalding, who had a Scottish name, was influenced by Macpherson, a fellow Scot, but I'll get into those textual evidences later. For now, let's focus on these naming clusters that I pulled out of Macpherson's 2 volumes. By far, the most striking syllable throughout both books, which are organized as books inside of books, by the way, is more, M-O-R, which I have placed in the middle of the slide. At the top of this alphabetical list is Camorra, which should be pronounced the way the British do, who say motor car instead of motor car. And what does Camorra mean? Fortunately, Macpherson tells us the etymology of Camorra in his footnotes, which he plausibly constructs from Gaelic syllables. Here he says that Carmora comes from Carn, moor, meaning high rocky hill. Fortunately, from other words, we learn that Car means rocky hill, and moor means great. In the first edition of the Book of Mormon, the hill Camorra was first spelled C-A-M-O-R-A-H and had the same pronunciation as Macpherson's Camorra. As you can see here, it was changed by an early scribe to an altered spelling for whatever reason. We have multiple indications that Spalding had read Macpherson's epic before writing his own, but there is no evidence or even reason to suspect that Smith had ever read Macpherson. Putting a hill from Macpherson's epic story into his own is just the kind of thing that Spalding would have done. But let's look at more words. According to Macpherson, Cathmore translates to great battle, from Cath meaning battle and more again meaning great. Clessamore, he says, means mighty deeds, with more meaning mighty here, which is pretty synonymous with great. Conmore contains con, which usually means warrior or hound, so Conmore means great warrior. One particular Conmore, however, in the story comes from a minority dialect. Canmore, we are told, means mild and tall, with con meaning mild and Mor again meaning great, but this time in the sense of height. Cremora means a woman of great soul, with Cre meaning soul, and Mora meaning great woman. Duth Carmor means dark Carmor, or dark high rocky hill. In this case, it is a place name that has been converted into a person name. Lamor means great hand, with lam meaning hand. Lamhor, with an H, is a variant of Lamhor, where the H changes the meaning from great to mighty. Spalding will also change the or suffix to the hor suffix for some of his fictional names. Larthmore means great sea, with Larth meaning sea, and Mor, yep, you guessed it, means great. Larthmore is the name Ossian gives to the great sea king who befriends Fingal. Malmor, interestingly, means great hill. Wait, didn't Carmora mean great hill? According to Macpherson, they both do. Rocky hills in Scotland and grassy hills in Ireland seemingly have their own words. Mora means a great plain or heath. The text suggests that the word was originally a fusion of Mor and Ruh, where Ruh would mean kingdom or of the kings. In the text, we have the chief of Mora, the heath of Mora, the deer of Mora, the towers of Mora, the breezes of Mora, the hills of Mora, Mora's rock, Mora's mist, and Mora's wind. It is apparently very mossy. Many battles are fought on the plains of Mora. Scouts ascend the hills of Mora as they look for vantage points, etc. Now recall that, quote, the land of Moron in the Book of Mormon is, quote, where the king dwelt. This is a detail that is directly borrowed from Macpherson's Mora, the great land of the kings. Spalding, of course, changed the ending to on in his manuscripts found because it sounds more biblically derived, like Sidon, Zion, etc. Immora is short for Innis Mora, which means great island. Moran has 5 meanings. 1, someone from Mora. 2, greatness. 3, a mighty man. 4, signifying many. And 5, one of the sons of Phithel. Morar means both great man and a man of Mora. Morla means place of worship, with the syllables literally meaning either great place or great stone, or both. In other words, an altar. Morla is also a minor character. Notice how Morla and Lamor above exhibit syllable swapping. This is also the case with Karos and Oscar. Karos is one of the first heroes, and Oscar is one of the last, so a little syllable swapping here and there adds to the fun of it all. Morlath means great in the day of battle. It is very similar to Cathmor, which means great in battle. Morlath is also a minor character. Here again, we have some imperfect syllable swaps. Larthmore goes to Morlath, and Morlath goes to Lathmon. Morna means a woman of Mora. It is also the wife of Comal, daughter of King Cormac, and the mother of Fingal. Morni is the chief of the Morni tribe. He has many sons, though some passages also refer to the daughters of Morni. Gaul, the greatest of all the sons of Morni, is often referred to in the text as just the son of Morni, even though he has brothers, kind of the same way that the brother of Jared is known in the Book of Mormon as just the brother of Jared. All the Morni are fierce and noble warriors. A crucial plot point is that Fingal's father is slain by Morni's sword. This sword of Morni, having been forged by ancient Luno, has been passed down from father to son for generations before Morni inherited it. Rumor has it that it was wielded by the legendary Strumon. At one point, Morni is buried with it, but later Gaul needs it, so he takes it from Morni's tomb, with Morni appearing as a ghost to give Gaul his blessing. But ultimately it becomes Fingal's sword after he reduces the armies of Morni. Before the end, however, Gaul joins with Fingal and Cathmor to fight a common enemy. Amazingly, Gaul, like Ajax in the Iliad, and Fingal become the best of friends, uniting their peoples. In the end, Fingal hangs the sword of Morni on the sacred walls of Temora and vows to not use it except in times of greatest danger. It is like the sword of Laban in the Book of Mormon that appears in battles for 1,000 years, but in the end gets hung unsheathed on the walls of Cumorah. I think it quite probable that Captain Moroni in the Book of Mormon is based on Macpherson's Morni. It is possible that Spalding changed Morni to Moroni himself, perhaps to disguise it a little bit by adding the letter O. It is also possible that Spalding put it in as Morni and that Smith changed it to Moroni later for his own reasons. Moruth is spelled two ways, with one and two R's. They each mean great stream or river. This stream flows out of Morven, which means great peaks. The suffix ven is presented as an older form of ben, B-E-N-N, which means peaks. Morven is also the name of the entire kingdom of Fingal, peaks, hills, and plains. Many chiefs and kings of the bloodthirsty clans live like bandits in the caves of Morven. Countless battles take place in the land of Morven. Narthmore means great strength. Now, the text doesn't say explicitly, but experts suggest that Rathmore probably means great fort, since Rath in Gaelic means fort, enclosure, or dwelling place. Whether it does or not, it was the name applied to the chief of Clutha, who has two famous sons, Calthon and Colmar. Slimora evidently also means great hill, but in the text it is not grassy, mossy, jagged, or rocky. Instead, it is highly wooded. If Joseph Smith had been into Macpherson, it would have been more fitting for him to have chosen Slimora for the name of the wooded hill in which he claimed to have found the plates, but Spalding had in mind a rocky hill, so he chose Cumorah instead, which he probably spelled with an AH ending to make it seem more Hebraic, per his well-established pattern. Later, it got ignorantly changed to Cumorah with a U through the Smith and scribe dictation only process. Temora is the Irish equivalent of Scotland's Morven. Etymologically, Temora can be broken down, according to Macpherson's semi-empirical, semi-whimsical lexicon, into three parts: t, mor, and r. Literally, these fragments translate to high great kings. More colloquially, however, Temora meant both high Mora and house of the great king. Temora is also the name of the royal palace in Erin, another name for Ireland. Temora is the place where the chiefs and local kings come to hold council with the high kings, and where the land's most sacred artifacts, like scrolls and swords, are displayed and safeguarded. In Scotland's Morven and Ireland's Temora, there are chiefs, kings, and high kings. The high kings are often the fathers of lower, more local kings, which idea Spalding also incorporates into his Mormon story. Think of King Lamoni and his father, who was, quote, the king over all the land, Alma 18:9. The tragic successions of leadership in both Erin and Scotland are especially echoed in the power dynamics that Spalding puts into Jaredite successions in the Book of Ether. For example, the High King Cormac at one point is murdered by his bloodthirsty son Caerbar, and in the sacred halls of Temora no less, which creates outrage, unrest, and violence throughout the kingdom. In time, Oscar, the grandson of Fingal, challenges Caerbar on the battlefield, where they inflict mortal wounds onto each other. Cathmor, who is Caerbar's brother, reluctantly assumes the Irish throne and nobly prepares for war against Fingal's Scotland. None of this is very accurate historically, of course, but that didn't bother Macpherson, who preferred to elevate mythological elements, thus willfully portraying a bygone era as the most glorious. Stories that don't do that, Spalding tells us, are consigned to dust and to the moth. Both Spalding and Macpherson were on that same page while composing their revisionist and even anachronistic translations of fictitious ancient abridgments. Trenmore literally means strong great. He is Fingal's great-great-grandfather and the founder of the line of kings in both Ireland and Scotland, according to Macpherson. The suffix mon appears in these 4 words, always with the meaning of mountain. Lathmon means battle mountain. Dún means stronghold, so Dunlathmon means battle mountain stronghold. Lumon means bending hill or bending mountain. Strumon means mountain stream, which is also the name of a dynasty whose geocultural center is the mountain stream. Mormon, then, if Spalding was trying to perfectly emulate Macpherson, would mean great mountain. Punningly, he also meant it to mean great man, with mon coming from the Greek mon, meaning man of, in the same way that his own name, Solomon, meant man of shalom, or man of peace. Punning in Greek was a hallmark of wit and education among members of the Republic of Letters. A true gentleman is like a mountain, always a man of his word. Such a construction agrees with the description Spalding gives of Mormon in what is now Mormon 2:1. Quote, "And notwithstanding I being young, was large in stature." Close quote. There are, however, other clues in the Romance of Celeste that Spalding was being even more creative, which I will get to soon. When Joseph Smith was asked in 1843 what Mormon meant, he had literally no idea, so he wrote up a transparently bad explanation that was published in the Times and Seasons. In short, he said that Mormon means more good, as if more in Reformed Egyptian meant more in the modern English sense, and mon meant good. Not surprisingly, neither claim checks out. If Smith really were moderately clever linguistically, he might have made Mormon by contracting more mammon, or even more money, given that was admittedly his original motivation. But no Mormon apologist or Smith's sole authorship apologist has ever published these much better formulations. Instead, they keep advocating for Mormon from Morgan, or Mormon from a 1 in 100,000 surname, or that it was all a big coincidence. In my book, I discuss other potential constructions that are far better than what Mr. Vogel sponsors. For example, in Spalding's mind, Mor could come from the Hebrew root morch, meaning teacher, and again with mon from the Greek, Mormon could therefore mean man of teaching, in honor perhaps of Spalding's favorite professor of Oriental languages. Or it could refer to being a tutor at the Moors Indian Charity School. In the same way that a man of Harvard is a Harvard man, a man of Moors might be a Moor man. Alternatively, a Moor can also be an Arab. Might Spalding have employed a literary echo back to the original Nephi with his Arabic name, who led his family through Arabia to get to the promised land of America? As we have seen, Spalding was fascinated enough by Arabian culture to incorporate it adeptly into his stories. Thinking about what Moor might have meant in Latin, conceivably, Spalding could have meant Moor to mean death, with Mor being a shortening of mortem. Mormon was the last Nephite, after all, or second to last if originally Spalding intended for his son to bury the plates of Mormon for him after he died. Consider how a great man, fighting his last battle on a mountain of death, might have been a stroke of literary genius on Spalding's part. Some or all of these things might have crossed Spalding's mind. As I said before, probably nothing crossed Smith's mind on this topic before 1843, the year before he died. But what about Mahonri Moriyankumer? I can hear some sole authorship apologists say. Doesn't that prove that Smith had constructed all the names in the Book of Mormon? Not at all. Someone asked Smith in 1834 if he knew what the name of the brother of Jared was. Later, in an 1835 letter to Oliver Cowdery, Smith said that his name was Moriyankumer. It would appear that Smith simply went to Ether 2, the chapter where the brother of Jared is instructed to make 8 invertible submarines, and there grabbed the first and only place name in the chapter, which was Moriancumer. A couple of years later, in a baby blessing, Smith named a child Mahonri Moriancumer. I suspect that he made up Mahonri on the spot as a permutation of Moroni so that he might not so easily forget the white lie. Smith was not a composer, he was an appropriator. He took things from other places, mutated them, and made them his own. But he was not very original, not very hardworking, and not very creative. And no one who knew him thought he was. But let's get back to Macpherson. It is clear from his footnotes that he tried to emulate Homer and Virgil. He mentions them specifically several times. Pause to read. Pause again. Again. And again. Homer's Iliad is an epic story of two peoples who are unable to reconcile, the Greeks and the Trojans. Virgil's Aeneid is Homeric fan fiction in which a worthy remnant of the House of Troy sails to a promised land, displaces the native peoples in Italy, and ultimately unifies the Latins and the Etruscans under one new Roman identity. Macpherson's Fingal and Timora together make one 2-volume epic story designed to create a shared heritage and history between the Irish and the Scottish by sensationalizing and enshrining into poetic literature the long-standing struggle and reconciliation between the Celts and the Picts. Spalding might have especially liked the juxtaposition of Gaul versus Fingal for another reason. Gaul was from the darker featured Duthno race, while Finn literally means fair, white, or blessed, depending on the context. So, the story of Gaul and Fingal is not only pseudo-history, but also an allegory that reconciles a 1,000-year struggle between two races, one of them supposedly lighter and more blessed than the other. I believe that Spalding attempted to write his biblically inspired American Aeneid in the same allegorical spirit with which Macpherson wrote his Aeneid. And he pulled naming patterns and even the more meaning great syllable because that's what sophisticated writers do. Spalding built on Macpherson's foundation, yes, but then adapted his name pattern approach to better suit his two goals. 1, to tie his person and place names to the Bible, and 2, to tie them to the regional landforms, especially rivers. Like Macpherson's names, Spalding's names are often suggestive of one's character, but not always, which only adds to the perceived authenticity. We all know of people who were named after a great ancestor, but turned out to have diametrically opposite values. Notice how Connor, using the translation key in the lower left-hand corner, would mean big warrior, with R being an augmentive suffix. Conan, in contrast, would mean little warrior or son of a warrior, with an being a diminutive suffix. Conar More would literally mean Conar the Great. Attaching more to the end of an existing name, then, conveys a special title. Spalding also might have done this in the Book of Mormon, just for fun, because why not? Coriantum becomes Coriantumer. Moriantum becomes Moriancumer. This is not the place to flesh out all of what I think Spalding meant with his syllables, but I'm fairly comfortable putting out there that cor may have meant expert, hor may have meant bad, kish may have meant evil, more may have meant great, ankum may have meant large, many, or exceeding, ir may have meant water or seas, as in irrigation, ripple also seems to have meant water, again from ripples, tu may have meant high or house, and mon might have punningly meant both mountain and man. How can we glean such things? Again, by careful attention to detail. Macpherson tells us that Cormar means expert at sea, Mar apparently means sea in both Gaelic and Latin. Hor has the connotation of evil, as does its homonym, Hor, W-H-O-R-E. We see these meanings play out in the story where Korihor rebelled against his father and, quote, drew away many people after himself, close quote. Korihor with a K is quite well known among Mormons for being an expert at evil speaking. Nehor is a contraction of Nephi and Hor, suggesting that he is a Nephite who has gone bad, which happens in the text. Recall that he slays Gideon, establishes an apostate sect during the time of Alma and Amulek, and uses priestcraft to enrich himself. Spalding tells us, in what is now 1 Nephi 17 verse 3, that Iriantum, quote, being interpreted means many waters. Similarly, the waters of Ripley-Ancum, we are told in what is now Ether 15 verse 8, is, quote, by interpretation, large or to exceed all, meaning large ripples or ripples to exceed all. Probably the most elusive of Spalding's etymologies heretofore has been the word Liahona, the name of his Kircheresque spiritually magnetic compass. But once you see Spalding's patterns, a better deconstruction of the word Liahona is pretty hard to unsee. Arguably, the four most important Hebrew suffixes, all of which play obvious roles in the Book of Mormon, are El, meaning God, Aya, which is both a Latinized form of Yah and an abbreviation of Yahweh, On, which is a common toponymic marker for place names, and Ah, with or without an H. By the way, adding an H to a noun ending in ah often makes the original word more theophoric or divinity-related than it was before. Spalding simply strung these suffixes together in the order shown on your screen. When L is used at the beginning of a word, it often shortens to just the letter L when going from Hebrew to Greek or Latin. A good example of this is Eleazar becoming Lazarus. So that's it. No great mystery after all. Both Spalding and Macpherson in some ways were like Tolkien, who constructed names, language patterns, and even rudimentary genealogies before endeavoring to write the plot. Spalding deconstructed words from his environment, from the Bible, and from literature to create baskets of syllables, which he then swapped around, changing prefixes and suffixes. He also chose to make some, but not all, of the names gradually change from the Jaredite story to the Mormon story and ultimately to the Fabius story, because that might show that it was all part of one epic multi-part manuscripts found. Spalding did all this because he knew that it had worked for Macpherson. Spalding was composing his manuscripts found in 1811, 50 years after Macpherson first published the poems of Ossian, and the Irish and Scottish were still defending that poetry as much as any other history. Recall that is exactly what Nahum Howard had said was Spalding's design in writing manuscripts found. I said earlier that there are clues in the Romance of Celeste that Spalding was influenced by Macpherson. The first clue is that the big villain in the story is a man named James Corydon Abram McPhellin. This was a fun bit of wordplay, replacing the RS within Macpherson with an L. It was also a disguised and very Scottish way of saying that both Macpherson and his villain were felons. In the text, we learn that McPhellin was, quote, a genius in iniquity. Mac, of course, means son of, so it was also like saying that McPhellin was a real son of a bitch. Here's another clue. Like Macpherson, Spalding gives his heroes a companion minstrel who breaks into poetry and song quite often, much the way that Fingal was accompanied by Ossian, who did the same. One of the Florentine heroes was a singing bard named Alfred. His backstory is that he had fought in Scotland against the robbers during the time of two corrupt kings, Ethelred of England and the Danish Viking Ubba. He, quote, had challenged 2 kings and now bids defiance to Ethelred's robbers and all the proud legions that Denmark can boast. Close quote. In the end, gratifyingly, Alfred gets his golden throne on Jupiter. Quote, in fact, 'tis England's pride to crown his honored head with laurels quite immortal, for not a spot has marred the name of Alfred. And if in due gradation souls immortal rise, 'tis time to find him ruling in the skies. Close quote. There are other clues, but for now, I'll leave it at that. Now back to Vogel.
Incidentally, there are no names beginning with Moore in Spalding's manuscript.
Here Mr. Vogel implies that if Spalding had composed both the Mormon story and the Fabius story, and if Moore is present in the Mormon story, then we should expect to see Moore in the Fabius story too. And if we don't, then the texts were probably written by different authors. Again, not at all. Although having this specific and additional connection between the Fabius and the Mormon story would be nice to have, no one should expect all syllables from one story to appear in another story by the same author. That notwithstanding, we do have many syllables in the Mormon story appearing in the Fabius story. Lab, lamb, ram, Sam, rod, etc., etc. We even have the Sword of Laban Co. and the Sword of Laban playing persistent roles in the plot of both stories, for crying out loud. But these are all just coincidences to Mr. Vogel due to the law of very large numbers, even though the numbers really aren't that large. I would say that Mr. Vogel's coincidence barometer needs to be seriously recalibrated. His current setting violates a higher law, the law against too many coincidences. But for fun, let's go with Mr. Vogel on this for a minute. If the syllable more were to appear as part of a proper name in the Romance of Celeste, in addition to obviously appearing in the Mormon story, then would that favor Spalding's subtheories at least a little bit? What if that proper name also contained the syllable mon? Surely then Mr. Vogel would update his priors in a truly Bayesian way. And what if that proper name, containing both syllables, were really important to the story, even participating in the climax of the book? Or would he find another excuse to dismiss it as a coincidental artifact of astronomically large numbers that aren't astronomical? I don't know why he didn't search the Romance of Celeste for such a proper noun before making the above retort, but he didn't. Remember how I mentioned that at the climax there was a great mountain, a Mormon, which was the source of Kishkumen's river, the one that got sliced through and slid off, crashing into the valley below? Well, here Spalding shows us his linguistic playfulness. Not only does he invert Mormon physically, with the high places being made low, like the scripture says, but he also does so linguistically by inverting the syllables, and that is how Mormon, the great mountain, became Mon Mor, the mountain of death. If you didn't catch it, by inverting the syllables and switching from Macpherson's Gaelic to Virgil's Latin, Mormon becomes Mon Mor, with Mon meaning mountain, like Olympus Mons, and Mor meaning death, coming from the Latin word mortem. Let's walk through the sentences from the climax that discuss Mount Moors specifically. Quote, Mount Moors, as the robbers call it, is the place of their headquarters. Close quote. While formulating a plan, the Florentines hear about, quote, a smuggled passage to the caverns of Mount Moors. After searching a while, one Florentine says, quote, it was impossible to avoid the impression that somewhere in this vicinity must be located Mount Moors, known only to the banditti by this name. Though scared, the heroes, quote, felt that nature had determined to expose their hidden works of darkness, and for aught they knew, the time was near at hand when Mount Moors should yield her strongholds to better tenants. Incidentally, the 3-gram works of darkness appears elsewhere in the Romance of Celeste and 14 times in Spalding's Mormon story, always in the context of hidden or secret works of darkness conducted by robbers. As we rounded the point, we discovered that we had gone too far. We were already upon the bandits' premises, whence no one had hitherto returned. This was Mount Moors, or the Mountain of Death, which had for a few years fed the banditti by the victims of avarice. Notice the phrase, whence no one had hitherto returned. It is similar to a prior phrase of Spalding's in the Book of Mormon, from whence no traveler can return, 2 Nephi 1:14, which itself is a play on Shakespeare's phrase, from whose bourne no traveler returns. In each usage, the narrator is talking about returning from death. Here we entered. I held Josephine's hand in mine, and had there been the least symptom of a wish to compromise with the powers of the enemy, I should have discovered it. Her faith was firmer than the mountains. And so it came to pass, those are my words, that the faith of Josephine, a Florentine heroine and the first of 3 female knights, surpassed that of all the others, sufficient to bring down the mountain of death and put an end to the Gadianton robbers of her generation. We later learned that it was, quote, perfectly in accordance with the laws of nature for Mount Moors to slide off when its weight had overcome all resistance. And that is how a nation came to sleep beneath that once great mountain. And thus we see that the syllable Moor does appear in another one of Spalding's manuscripts, and intimately associated with the syllable Mon, even though it didn't have to. Obviously, we're very lucky to have it. I love that Spalding is so deliberate and thoughtful in his storytelling, weaving in biblical themes like having the faith to move a literal mountain with dramatic inversions, both physical and linguistic, at the same time. Notice also that if you literally take God out of Mount Moriah, the name of the mountain in the book of Genesis where Abraham was obediently ready to sacrifice Isaac, you get the mountain of death, implying that without God, there is only spiritual death. According to the Book of Chronicles and Western esoteric tradition, Mount Moriah was also the location of Solomon's temple, and not surprisingly, that is also where our Solomon puts his subterranean American temple, which was built by ancient masons. And what's fun is if you say Mount Moors in French, you get Mon Mont. And now get this, who is the Florentine hero who, while sitting at the head of the Florentines' dinner table in a tavern not far from Mount Moors, comes up with a plan to infiltrate the robbers, even volunteering to go undercover himself inside the Mountain of Death as a double agent? His name is Monsieur de Midicus Moncari, whom you have already met. Notice that his Florentine surname, like that of his partner de Stael, is French, which is another allusion to the French literature of the Enlightenment that Spalding so admired. Moncari, if you didn't know, literally means a gentle mountain, and punningly means a gentleman. Always looking for puns across languages, Spalding portrays Moncari as a true gentleman who, like a mountain, is always a mon indeed. And now recall that the French Jesuit Pierre de Montmort, who was depicted as quite the opposite of a great man and the opposite of a gentleman, especially at the dinner table, was infamously ridiculed for being a voracious glutton, thereby earning the title Le Parasite Mormon, or Mormon the Parasite. So, just as Monmort suffered a devastating verlan, or inversion of his syllables, becoming the caricature Mormon, the Great Mountain also suffered a devastating inversion of syllables and a physical inversion at the same time, becoming the Mountain of Death. Incidentally, Spalding plays with mon and mount elsewhere in his writings too. For example, in the Book of Mormon, he takes the biblical Mount Hermon, inverts its syllables, and produces Hermounts. We know that is what Spalding was doing because in Deuteronomy 3:8, we learn that Mount Hermon is the northern boundary of the Promised Land, and Spalding says in Alma 2:37 that the Nephites drove the Lamanites out of their land to the northern border, which is called Hermounts. Spalding also incorporates Mount Hermon in two other places within the Romance of Celeste. Notice also how Domiticus Montgary's first name is a clear allusion to Kircher. Recall that the de Medici family were the ones who bankrolled Kircher's Romance of the Heavens, while his last name is a clear allusion to Monmort, to the French practice of Verlan, and to French literature in general. Mr. Vogel could have checked his bias at the door long enough to reread the Romance of Celeste, this time with an open mind, and the clues I gave him as I invited him to do publicly before attempting a smackdown. But he didn't. That was his choice, and he gets to live with the consequences. Wait, you might be asking yourself, did Lars just try to pull a fast one, likening these modern-day bandits to the Gadianton robbers instead of to the band of Kishkumen, as if I wouldn't notice? What's his basis for that? Fortunately, Spalding explains the basis for that, 2 times actually, once on page 136 and again on page 348 of the Romance of Celeste. At one point in Philander's adventure, an informant tells him, quote, "I have to inform you that the vigilance of the banditti exceeds all human ingenuity, and were you to watch their maneuvers for 10 years, you would scarcely know where to suspect an accomplice or track out their hiding places. You have found by sad experience what they do with their victims, whom they suspect will expose their iniquity. And let me tell you, they will never leave you, so long as they can find means and methods for your destruction. In skill and secrecy, they outgeneral the brigands of the Sierra Morena." Close quote. So, Spalding here, through his characters, is comparing these specific modern-day robbers to the ones that hid in the Sierra Morena. But who are they? 200 pages later, as the Florentines approach the Great Mountain from the west, they see, quote, "the blue summits of the Allegheny in the eastern horizon. The Allegheny Mountains were before us, and our approximation to that stupendous wall appeared to augment its relative height in more than a direct ratio as its distance. And the tales of the Spanish brigades upon the Sierra Morena revived afresh in our memories, even to the very letter." Close quote. Here, Philander is very close to the base of the Great Mountain, which looks huge, like a stupendous wall. He thinks about the bandits hiding therein, and once again the tales of Spanish brigands descending from the Sierra Morena come to his memory so perfectly that he can remember every word of the story. This is Spalding telling us that he had read and absolutely loved Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. We know this is what he means because in 2 far-apart scenes, he likens a woman in the scene to, quote, "a modern Dulcinea," whom Don Quixote regards, if you'll remember, as his flawless love interest. This is the Sierra Morena, north of Cadiz, Spain. The robbers in Don Quixote descend from these mountains and attack people on the road. This whole southern region is called Gaditania, pronounced like Britannia, and the people who live there are called Gaditanos. This river, which divides Spain from Portugal, is today called the Guadiana River, with the wa sound within gua, owing to the phonological drift that resulted from the Moorish invasion. Wadi means river in Arabic. In earlier centuries, Cadiz was pronounced Gadit before the G got devoiced and the plosive T became a dental fricative th. Before that, it was Gades, like Hades, which is where Spalding's connotation of Gades being bad or associated with death might have come from. In ancient times, the pirates of Gades would hide out past the Pillars of Hercules after the fall of Carthage. The Pillars of Hercules, if you didn't know, are the giant rock formations on either side of the modern-day Strait of Gibraltar. We know that Spalding was educated on this because, in a totally different part of the Romance of Celeste, he compared the underground columns of rock near the subterranean American temple with the, quote, Herculean pillars that scorn Atlantic tides, close quote. After the American Revolutionary War, the United States agreed to pay tribute to the Barbary states, what is now Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, in order to access shipping lanes to the Mediterranean Sea through the Pillars of Hercules. When Thomas Jefferson no longer wanted to pay the tribute, the Barbary pirates started attacking and raiding U.S. ships, which led to the First Barbary War, which ended a year or so before Spalding made the decision to publish his romantic fiction. Likening the modern-day Barbary pirates to their ancestors, the Gaditanian pirates, and seeing how Miguel de Cervantes wove the Gaditanian pirates into his fiction, Don Quixote, Spalding decided to do the same with his own fiction. So, in the Romance of Celeste, Philander is thinking about the Gaditanian robbers of the Sierra Morena while he is approaching the Great Mountain / Mountain of Death from the west, which is clearly this region, according to the Fabius story, traveling along the river that Spalding associates with Kishkumen in his Mormon story. Now recall that Gadianton is Kishkumen's successor in the Mormon story, becoming the new leader of the Kishkumen robbers, thus transforming them into the infamous Gadianton robbers, who are, quote, the most ferocious band of murderers that ever disgraced humanity, according to the Fabius story. These robbers are not peripheral, but central to the plots of all 4 stories on this slide. To me, this is good evidence that Spalding had thought about Don Quixote and the robbers of the Sierra Morena while composing the Mormon story, which was after he had composed the Fabius story, having chosen this setting to be a mental anchor in all his stories, which was not far from where Spalding lived between 1812 and 1816, and not far from where he planned on publishing and selling his stories. Then, a year or so later, he decided to rekindle the thought and casually allude to those Gaditanian robbers from the Sierra Morena while writing the Romance of Celeste. He didn't have to do that, but he did. And thus we see that yet again, Spalding takes a modern river, the Guadiana River, imagines a more ancient version of it, the Gadiana River, without the U, and starts to play around with the associated place name Gaditania, in hopes of generating a person name that has one of his favorite biblical suffixes, in this case, on. Thus, by playing with the location of the T sound within Gaditanian, he produces Gadianton, who is the successor of Kishkumen and the namesake for the robbers of Gadianton. There should be no doubt at this point that while writing what eventually became the Book of Mormon, Spalding, in real life, literally imagined the diluted blood of ancient Gaditanian-like Native American robbers flowing through Kishkumen's river, or Kishkumen's Etos, if you will, and further imagined that such a story was forgotten ancient American mythology that barely survived inside the word Kishkumenetus. Diverting a river so that it would cleanse the blood-stained earth as an answer to prayer was Spalding's way of remaking a detail from a favorite Old World Bible story into New World biblical fan fiction, with the ancient river Kishon being a type for the modern river Kishkumen, again in his mind. These patterns are very consistent, quite revealing, and for me, most endearing. For the record, I think that Spalding created Gadianton first, and then evolved Morianton and Corianton using his favorite prefixes Mor and Cor, exactly the way that Macpherson played with Mor and Cor. Think of Cormac, for example, who was one of the most famous kings of Ireland. Incidentally, Corianton appears for the first time in the Book of Mormon in Alma 31. Morianton comes next in Alma 50. Gadianton is the last of the rhyming triad, showing up in Helaman 2. Again, Smith did not compose the Book of Mormon by blurting out 591 pages in 60 working days, making up variations of words as he went along in real time. In sharp contrast, Spalding thought about epic literature, the history of the world, the noblest of heroes, and the worst of villains for decades before he started to compose his epic and romantic fiction. Again, the way to truly understand the Book of Mormon is to really get inside the mind of its most original author, who was Solomon Spalding, not Joseph Smith. We need to study all of what Spalding wrote so that we can fully glean everything that influenced him and why. We need to reopen our minds to old possibilities, but this time seeing Spalding, Rigdon, and Smith for who they were, and not who they might have been under the false assumption of Smith's sole authorship. For the first 100 years, I should remind us, Solomon Spalding was the best and only serious candidate author for the Book of Mormon. He was the only game in town, and for good reason. Unfortunately, flawed reasoning from non-experts like Walter Prince derailed the authorship question, which got further entrenched by Brodie's otherwise excellent 1945 book, No Man Knows My History. In it, she said that the Book of Mormon, quote, reveals in Smith what both Orthodox Mormon histories and unfriendly testimony deny him, a measure of learning and a fecund imagination, close quote. No, Fawn Brodie, that is not what the Mormon story reveals. Smith was denied these because he did not have them. At best, Joseph Smith was a plagiarist. He plagiarized from Rigdon/Spalding. He plagiarized from Adam Clarke. All the evidence shows that it was Solomon Spalding who had many measures of learning and a very fecund imagination. Smith was not 1/100th of the man that Solomon Spalding was. That goes for education, imagination, creativity, ability to write, love of literature, love of linguistics, love of history, kindness to others, fidelity to his wife, and all the rest. All right, everything that I just shared with you is what I'm calling part 1 of my 2-part response to Dan Vogel's 2 takedown videos. I hadn't originally planned on sharing so much new stuff from the Romance of Celeste and from Macpherson's Fingal and Timora, but I felt that it was appropriate under the circumstances. I hope you appreciated it. I'll share more details that link the Romance of Celeste to the Mormon story when I am done with my current project, which is to get all of the works of Solomon Spalding published, including the Romance of Celeste, together with all the rich commentary and footnotes necessary to do justice to the man whose measure of learning and fecund imagination started a religion against what would have been his will. In part 2, I will deal with the rest of Mr. Vogel's counterclaims and criticisms before going into that editorial sidebar that I mentioned before. The rest of his counterclaims and criticisms, not surprisingly, all fall into one or more of the same categories that have heretofore betrayed Mr. Vogel as less of a serious historian and more of a sole authorship apologist. 1, he mischaracterizes more of my arguments. 2, he hides crucial information. 3, he commits factual errors that should have been caught through his own fact-checking. And 4, he continues to apply the unprofessional rhetoric that, most unfortunately, may, in the end, seal his testimony on the wrong side of history unless he repents. It will take some time, but with patience and persistence through persecution, the true story for how the Book of Mormon came to pass will be accepted by the honest in heart academic community. Thank you for your time and for your attention.